My name is Brooke Foster. I am 28 years old. 2 months ago, I drove back to Michigan from a 3-week business trip in Chicago, exhausted but ready to sleep in my own bed. The bed inside the lakefront house my grandmother had left solely to me. But when I pulled into my driveway, the rain pouring down my windshield, I did not see my empty porch. I saw a moving truck. I saw a family of strangers carrying boxes through my front door. The locks were changed. My belongings were gone. Before the shock could even register, my father David pulled his truck onto the gravel right behind me. He stepped out into the rain, crossing his arms. He wore a smirk I will never forget. "Do not bother unpacking, Brooke," he said, his voice carrying over the storm. "We sold it. Your house paid for Lexi and Brad to have some fun in Europe." He waited for me to cry. He expected me to scream and beg. That was his favorite game. But the panic evaporated. I looked at the strangers. I looked back at my father, and I smiled. "Why are you so calm?" he shouted, his smirk turning into a scowl. I leaned in and kept my voice level. "Because, Dad, the house you just sold was—" I turned on my heel and walked away. Before I tell you the rest of this story, if you find yourself connecting with it, please take a second to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely want to stick around. And let me know where you are listening from and what time it is there. I always read the comments to see where my new friends are tuning in from. Now let me take you back to how this nightmare actually began. For as long as I can remember, the foster family dynamic operated on a very simple rule. My older sister Lexi was the golden child, and I was the afterthought. I work as a UX designer for a tech firm in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I spend my days identifying friction and fixing broken systems. But there was no fixing my family. My parents measured worth in status symbols and country club appearances. Lexi and her husband Brad fit their mold perfectly. Brad was a junior finance guy who drove a leased Porsche and wore expensive loafers without socks. I was just the quiet daughter who preferred coding to cocktail hours. 6 months ago, my grandmother passed away. She owned a beautiful A-frame cabin on the lake. It smelled of old cedar and rain. When the estate attorney read her will, my parents sat in his office with champagne already chilling in their car. They assumed the reading was a mere formality. They believed the house was Lexi's birthright, the perfect asset to liquidate to fund Brad and Lexi's lavish lifestyle. Then the attorney handed the deed to me. I still remember the silence in that room. My father's jaw tightened so hard the muscle ticked under his skin. My mother Susan let her practiced smile fracture into a bitter line. Lexi just stared at her manicured nails, while Brad let out a short, cynical laugh. No one said congratulations. No one said Grandma loved you. My mother stood up and grabbed her purse. "You do not even entertain guests, Brooke," she said, her tone sharp and dismissive. "What are you going to do with a lake house? Lexi needs the equity." I looked at the deed in my hands. "It is not for sale, Mom. It is my home now." That was the first time I ever told them no. They did not take it well. For months they waged a quiet war of attrition. They dropped hints at every family dinner. They sent me listings of small, cramped apartments in the city, telling me the lake house was too much responsibility for someone single. They spun a narrative to their friends that I was selfish, hoarding a family asset, while my sister struggled to afford the luxury European vacation she had been planning for years. I ignored them. I moved my things into the cabin. I painted the walls. I made it mine. A few weeks after the will reading, my parents invited me to Sunday dinner. I knew it was a trap the moment I walked through the door. My mother served roast beef and resentment. Lexi spent the entire meal scrolling through travel blogs on her phone, sighing heavily. Brad swirled his wine and talked about the stock market, treating my father like a prospective client rather than a father-in-law. "It is just a shame," my mother said suddenly, dropping her fork onto her china plate. "Lexi and Brad have been planning this European tour for 3 years. Santorini, the Amalfi Coast, Rome. And now they might have to scale it back because family resources are tied up." She looked directly at me. I kept cutting my food. "Grandma's house is not a family resource, Mom," I said quietly. "It is my house." David slammed his hand on the table. The glasses rattled. "It is an asset, Brooke," he snapped. "An asset you do not need. You sit in front of a computer all day. You do not entertain. Lexi has a lifestyle to maintain. Brad has clients to impress. That lake property could fund their trip and put a comfortable cushion in their portfolio. They looked at me like I was a stubborn child refusing to share a toy. They did not see my home. They saw a giant ATM, and I was standing in front of the keypad. I wiped my mouth with a napkin, stood up, and grabbed my coat. "Have a good trip, Lexi," I said. I walked out, leaving my untouched dinner on the table. I thought setting that boundary would buy me some peace. I thought they would eventually accept reality. I was wrong. The pressure only escalated. 3 days later, Brad showed up at my front door uninvited. He parked his Porsche right on my lawn, leaving deep tire tracks in the damp grass. He walked up the wooden steps, looking around with a sneer. "Place needs work," he said, not bothering to say hello. He leaned against the porch railing, acting like he already owned the timber beneath his feet. "Look, Brooke, let us cut the nonsense. Your parents are upset. Lexi is crying every night. You are being stubborn over a piece of wood and glass." I stood in the doorway, blocking his path. "It is not for sale, Brad." He laughed, a sharp, grating sound. "Everything has a price. Sign the deed over to David. He handles the sale, Lexi gets her trip, and we cut you a check for 10%. It is more cash than you have ever seen." I stared at him, noting the slight sweat on his forehead, despite the cool breeze. "Get off my porch." His smile vanished. His eyes turned cold. "You are making a mistake, Brooke. Families look out for each other. You do not want to be on the outside of this family." I closed the door in his face and locked the deadbolt. I watched through the window as he kicked a loose stone on the driveway before speeding off. I brushed off the encounter as simple arrogance. I had no idea how desperate he truly was. Then my company threw a wrench into my routine. My boss called me into his office on a Tuesday morning and told me I was heading up a major client integration in Chicago. 3 weeks on site. It was a huge career milestone for me. I felt a surge of pride. I drove home that evening and started packing my suitcase. I did not realize my absence was exactly what my parents were waiting for. The night before my flight, my phone buzzed on the kitchen island. It was my father. I answered it while folding a sweater. "Hello." "Brooke," he said, his voice too smooth, too casual. "Just checking in. Your mother said you had that Chicago contract starting tomorrow." "Yes, I leave in the morning," I replied, double-checking my laptop charger. 3 weeks in the city. 3 weeks, he repeated. A long time. I could hear the faint sound of ice clinking in a glass on his end. "You locking up the lake house?" "Yes, the security system is armed and the thermostat is set. Focus on your work, kid. We will keep an eye on things around here." The line went dead. He did not wish me safe travels. He did not say he was proud of my promotion. He was just confirming my schedule. I should have recognized the hollow ring to his voice, the tactical edge of someone double-checking a blind spot. But I was focused on my job. I walked out the front door the next morning, the Michigan wind whipping off the water. I locked the door, trusting the heavy brass hardware to protect what was mine. I got into my car and drove toward the interstate, leaving the house behind. I had no idea that my parents viewed my professional milestone as a green light. They assumed I was too meek to ever challenge them. They wanted to gift the proceeds to Lexi, and they did not care what laws they had to break to get it. I headed to Chicago, entirely unaware of the betrayal already being drafted in my own family living room. The windshield wipers beat a steady, relentless rhythm against the glass as I drove the final stretch back from Chicago. The sky over Lake Michigan had turned a bruised purple gray, promising a heavy storm that was already delivering in sheets of freezing rain. For 21 days, I had sat in high-rise boardrooms overlooking the Chicago River. I had led a team of developers, mapped out complex user journeys, and commanded respect from industry veterans. Executives had shaken my hand and praised my efficiency. In that city, I had built a professional life where my voice mattered. But crossing the Michigan state line always triggered the same old anxiety. The closer I got to Grand Rapids, the more the confident professional melted away, leaving behind the quiet, overlooked sister. I kept telling myself things would be different now. I had my own property. I had a physical sanctuary where David and Susan held no authority. a place where Lexi and Brad could not intrude. I pictured the cedar walls and the quiet solitude of the lake. I needed that quiet. I turned my steering wheel, bringing the car onto the rural route. The tall pines created a dense canopy over the road. The gravel crunched loudly beneath my tires as I navigated the winding path to my property. The A-frame cabin sat back from the road designed by my grandmother to keep the outside world out. But the world had clearly breached the perimeter. I slammed on the brakes. My tires skidded slightly in the mud. A bright orange moving truck sat parked right in front of my wooden porch, blocking the driveway entirely. The metal loading ramp was extended down to the wet grass. Cardboard boxes wrapped in thin plastic to shield them from the downpour were stacked precariously near the stairs. A middle-aged man wearing a yellow rain slicker wrestled a heavy floral-patterned armchair up the steps. A woman followed close behind him, balancing a tall stack of smaller boxes labeled kitchenwares. My first thought was a simple navigational error. The lake roads can be confusing in bad weather. They had the wrong address. I threw my car into park, leaving the engine idling and the headlights shining directly onto the orange truck. I stepped out into the storm. The chill soaked through my thin blouse almost instantly, but my adrenaline spiked, masking the cold. "Hey!" I shouted, waving my arms as I jogged toward the porch. "You have the wrong house!" The man paused, resting the floral chair against his hip. He wiped rainwater from his forehead and looked down at me with mild confusion. The guilt I expected to see on a trespasser was entirely absent. He just looked annoyed by the interruption. "No, I do not think so," he called back over the sound of the rain. "We just got the keys yesterday morning." I walked closer, my shoes sinking deep into the wet earth of the front yard. "Keys," I repeated, my voice trembling with a mixture of cold and rising dread. "What keys? This is my property. I live here." The woman set her boxes down on the wet wooden deck. She exchanged a worried, nervous glance with her husband. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a shiny brass key, holding it up as proof. "The real estate agent gave them to us at closing," she said, her tone shifting from polite defensive. "We closed on Thursday. The previous owners cleared everything out over the weekend." The phrase "cleared everything out" hit me like a physical blow. I pushed past them, ignoring their protests, and rushed to the large front window. I cupped my hands against the wet glass to block the glare. The living room was barren. My grandmother's antique rug, the cedar console table, the sofa I had spent hours cleaning, and the bookshelves I had painstakingly organized. All of it was gone. The space was stripped down to the bare floorboards. Even through the glass, I could imagine the sterile smell of industrial bleach replacing the scent of aged wood and memories. Someone had methodically erased my existence from the building in a matter of days. A wave of intense nausea washed over me, making my knees feel weak. My hands shook as I reached into my pocket for my phone. I needed to call the police. I needed to report a break-in. I was dialing the numbers when a set of high-beam headlights cut through the gloom. A silver truck turned off the main road and pulled into the driveway, parking dangerously close to my sedan. I recognized the custom grille. I recognized the personalized license plate. It was my father. The engine cut off, but the headlights remained on, casting harsh shadows across the wet grass. The driver's side door swung open. David stepped out into the storm. He wore a high-end waterproof jacket, his hair styled perfectly despite the weather. He did not rush to get out of the rain. He did not pull his collar up against the cold. Instead, he walked toward the porch with the slow, measured stride of a man taking a victory lap. The wet gravel crunched heavily under his expensive boots. He stopped at the bottom of the wooden steps. He looked at the orange moving truck, then at the new owners standing awkwardly on the porch, and finally his gaze settled on me. He crossed his arms over his chest. He wore a smug, satisfied expression that chilled me more than the freezing rain ever could. It was the exact face of a man who believed he had just checkmated his opponent. "Do not bother unpacking, Brooke," he said, his voice projecting easily over the sound of the downpour. The new owners shifted uncomfortably, realizing they had stepped into the middle of a toxic family dispute. They backed away toward the open front door, leaving me alone at the wooden rail. I stood on the porch, looking down at the man who was supposed to protect me. "What did you do?" I asked. My voice was barely a whisper, but I knew he heard every single word. "I fixed the problem," he replied, stepping up onto the first stair to close the distance. He wanted me to hear the details. "Lexi and Brad are boarding a direct flight to Rome tomorrow evening. They upgraded to first class. They have a private villa booked in Tuscany for the second week and a yacht charter waiting in Greece. It is going to be the trip of a lifetime." He leaned forward, resting his hand on the railing. "Your house paid for their fun. You should feel proud, Brooke. You finally contributed something meaningful to this family." He waited. He stood there in the pouring rain, anticipating the breakdown he felt he deserved. He expected tears. He expected me to scream at him, to demand my furniture back, to threaten lawsuits I could never afford to pursue. He wanted me to fall to my knees on that wet wooden porch and validate his dominance. He wanted to see me broken and desperate so he could offer a fake, sympathetic smile and tell me it was just business. He wanted me to know my place in the hierarchy. For a fraction of a second, the panic almost won. The reality of my empty house, the stolen belongings, and the sheer audacity of the betrayal pressed down on my chest like a physical weight. But then the logic center of my brain kicked in. The part of me that untangles complex code and anticipates user errors went to work. I remembered the paperwork I had signed months ago. I remembered the specific legal maneuvers I had executed in secret long before I packed my bags for Chicago. The panic vanished. It evaporated into the damp air, replaced by a cold, calculating calm that settled over my mind like heavy armor. The rain stopped feeling cold. The situation stopped feeling terrifying. It just felt like a puzzle that had already been solved by someone else's catastrophic error. I looked at the confused new homeowners hovering in the doorway, holding their shiny, useless key. I looked at the cheap silver lock installed on the doorframe. Then I looked back down at my father. I let the silence stretch. I let the sound of the storm fill the space between us, and then I smiled. It was not a brave smile. It was not a polite customer service smile. It was a genuine, terrifying expression of pure realization. David saw the shift. His smug expression faltered. He uncrossed his arms. "Why are you so calm?" he shouted, his voice suddenly lacking its previous authority. His smirk turned into a scowl of deep uncertainty. I stepped down onto the first stair, bringing myself closer to his eye level. I kept my voice perfectly level, cutting through the noise of the rain. "Because, Dad, I said the house you just sold was..." I turned on my heel, leaving him standing in the mud. I walked back to my car, dropping the ultimate cliffhanger and letting the trap snap shut. I sat in my sedan, listening to the rain hammer the roof. The engine idled while the heater blasted warm air over my freezing hands. In the rearview mirror, I watched my father pull his silver truck out of the driveway and speed off into the storm, confident he had won. He thought he had outsmarted me. He thought the game was over. To understand why I walked away from my own property with a smile, you have to understand what happened exactly 1 month prior. It started on a quiet Sunday afternoon. I was sitting on the floor of the lake house, sorting through the final boxes of my grandmother's personal items. My grandmother was not the stereotypical sweet elder who spent her days knitting quietly in a rocking chair. She was a retired corporate bookkeeper who navigated the brutal economic downturns of the early 80s with a steel spine. She saw right through the expensive suits my father wore and the leased sports cars my brother-in-law drove. She recognized the difference between actual wealth and the cheap illusion of it. I was packing up her small library when a folded piece of heavy cardstock slipped from the pages of a vintage copy of Jane Eyre. I opened it. The handwriting was sharp and slanted. It was a letter addressed directly to me, dated 3 weeks before her passing. "Brooke," she wrote, "I am leaving you this property because you are the only one in this family who understands the value of a solid foundation. David and Susan will try to take it from you. They will use guilt, they will use pressure, and if those tactics fail, they will use deceit. Do not hold this asset in your personal name. Protect it. Make yourself untouchable." I sat on the dusty floorboards, reading those words over and over until the sunlight faded from the room. She had predicted their betrayal long before the will was even read. She knew my parents viewed me as a soft target, a passive daughter who would eventually cave to their demands. I decided right then to honor her final instruction. The very next morning, I drove 2 hours east to Detroit. I did not search for a friendly neighborhood family lawyer who specialized in mediation. I sought out the kind of legal counsel you hire when you expect a brutal war. His name was Thomas Caldwell. His office sat on the 40th floor of a sleek glass skyscraper overlooking the dark waters of the Detroit River. The reception area smelled of polished mahogany and expensive espresso. Thomas Caldwell was a silver-haired corporate litigator who wore bespoke suits and spoke with clinical precision. He did not handle amicable divorces or petty civil disputes. He built financial fortresses. I sat across his wide desk, handing him the deed to the lake house and the handwritten letter from my grandmother. He read the note in total silence. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked at me, calculating my resolve. Holding raw real estate in your personal name makes you incredibly vulnerable to frivolous claims and familial coercion, Ms. Foster, he explained, tapping a silver pen against the desk. If they drag you into court contesting the will, the legal fees alone could force you to sell. We need to sever your direct liability. We will create a shield they cannot penetrate. Over the next 2 weeks, Caldwell executed a masterclass in asset protection. We did not merely transfer the property into a basic revocable trust. Caldwell established a sophisticated limited liability company. He then nested that LLC underneath the umbrella of a formidable commercial real estate development firm based in downtown Detroit, one of his premier corporate clients. We filed the transfer with the county clerk, binding the property to an entity with infinite legal resources. By the time the ink dried, the A-frame cabin no longer belonged to Brooke Foster. It belonged to a sprawling corporate structure. I was simply a protected minority shareholder hidden behind layers of corporate veils. If anyone wanted to challenge the ownership, they would not be facing a quiet 28-year-old UX designer. They would be going toe-to-toe with a billion-dollar conglomerate armed with a team of ruthless litigators who destroyed fraudulent claims for sport. I kept this defensive maneuver entirely secret. I went back to my daily routine, enduring my family's snide remarks and Brad's arrogant visits, never once mentioning the structural shift in my portfolio. I let them believe I was holding on to a vulnerable piece of paper. Now, sitting in the driver's seat of my sedan, wiping the condensation from the inside of my windshield, the pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind. The shock of the strange family moving into the cabin faded, giving way to sharp, analytical clarity. My father had just told me he sold the house. He claimed the proceeds funded Lexi and Brad's European vacation. But the property belonged to the corporate trust. The county registry reflected that legal transfer. Title insurance companies rely on that registry to underwrite any real estate sale. For David to finalize a transaction, collect $250,000, and hand a shiny brass key to those confused buyers, he had to bypass the title protocols. He could not have done that legally. My mind raced, connecting the dots as the rain continued to pound the hood of my car. Brad worked in high-level finance. He understood real estate transactions, escrow accounts, and title transfers. He knew the system inside and out. To sell the cabin, David and Brad had to have forged a quitclaim deed, transferring the property from the corporate entity back to David. Or worse, they forged my signature and the signatures of the corporate officers on federal closing documents. They had to bypass the rigorous checks of the title insurance underwriters, likely utilizing a corrupt notary willing to turn a blind eye for a cut of the illicit profits. The air in the car suddenly felt very thin. I unrolled the window a fraction, letting the cold, damp breeze hit my face. This was no longer a toxic family dispute over favoritism. This was not about my mother serving roast beef and resentment at Sunday dinner. This was felony wire fraud. This was grand theft. This was title forgery on a federal level. My father and my brother-in-law had crossed a line that erased them from the realm of bad relatives and placed them directly into the category of federal criminals. They orchestrated a complex illegal scheme, assuming I would be too intimidated to ever verify the paperwork. They thought I would just cry on the porch, accept defeat, and move on with my life. My phone glowed in this cup holder, illuminating the dark interior. I stared at the blank screen. I could drive down the rural route right now and walk into the local police precinct. I could sit at a metal desk and file a police report. The local authorities would open an investigation. They would send detectives to question David at his country club. The process would be slow, bureaucratic, and agonizingly drawn out. My parents would hire expensive defense attorneys to drag my name through the mud, claiming I was a vindictive, jealous daughter, making false accusations to ruin my sister's happiness. I reached out and turned off the phone screen, plunging the car back into darkness. I was not going to call the police. I was going to let the corporate beast they unwittingly poked handle the execution. A multi-million-dollar development firm does not tolerate golf course braggarts stealing their assets. The title insurance company would discover the fraudulent transfer the moment the new buyers tried to file a permit for renovations or secure their own secondary financing. When that happened, the corporate litigators would descend on my father and Brad with a fury the local police could never match. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the lake house. I left my grandmother's cabin in the rear-view mirror, feeling a strange, undeniable sense of liberation. Let them enjoy their first-class flights. Let them sip champagne on yachts in the Mediterranean. They were spending stolen money, believing they had secured their future by destroying mine. They were digging their own grave, and I was going to politely hand them the shovel. But as I merged onto the dark interstate heading back toward the city limits of Grand Rapids, a new immediate problem surfaced. I had no furniture, no clothes aside from my Chicago suitcase, and no place to sleep tonight. More importantly, I knew Lexi would be posting her lavish vacation all over social media by morning, documenting the exact trail of the illicit funds. I needed to secure a cheap apartment fast and begin archiving every single photo, every geotag, and every boastful comment. The corporate lawyers would need an ironclad paper trail to follow the money, and I was about to become their lead investigator while facing a brutal smear campaign orchestrated by my own mother. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, keeping my eyes on the wet road ahead. The real war was just beginning. The next morning, I signed a month-to-month lease on a cramped apartment on the outskirts of Grand Rapids. Rent was $900. The building smelled of old onions and damp carpet. My front door had a sticky deadbolt, and the single window in my living room looked out over a cracked asphalt parking lot. I had my suitcase from Chicago, my laptop, and a cheap air mattress I bought at a local pharmacy. My salary as a UX designer was more than enough to afford a luxury loft downtown, but I needed to remain invisible. Spending money drew attention, and right now silence was my greatest asset. I unpacked my few clothes and set up my workstation on a folding card table. I heated water in a cheap microwave and ate instant ramen noodles out of a styrofoam cup. While I sat in the dim light of my cheap rental eating sodium-soaked noodles, my sister was living a digital fantasy funded by a federal crime. Lexi had always treated social media like a competitive sport. Growing up, she needed an audience for every minor achievement. A new handbag required a photo shoot, a dinner date required a geographic tag, and a carefully crafted paragraph about being spoiled. Brad fed into that obsession. He courted her with leased cars and reserved tables at exclusive clubs, building a facade of old money wealth on a junior analyst's salary. Now they had $250,000 stolen dollars burning a hole in their pockets, and they were eager to show the world exactly how they were spending it. I opened my laptop and created a secure encrypted folder on my hard drive. I named it the European Tour. Day 1 began in Rome. Lexi posted a photo of herself standing on a sun-drenched balcony overlooking the Spanish Steps. She wore a silk designer dress holding a crystal flute. The caption read, "So blessed to have a family that supports my dreams. Thank you, Mom and Dad, for making this fairy tale a reality." She tagged my parents. She tagged the 5-star hotel. She tagged the designer of her dress. I took a screenshot. I logged the date, the time, and the location. I saved the image into the secure folder. Day 4 shifted to the Amalfi Coast. The photos showed Brad posing on the deck of a private chartered yacht. He wore crisp linen trousers and designer sunglasses holding a bottle of vintage champagne. The Mediterranean Sea glittered bright blue behind him. He looked like a man without a single care in the world, entirely oblivious to the legal landmine ticking beneath his Italian leather loafers. He posted a video tour of their cliffside villa showcasing the infinity pool and the private chef preparing their dinner. Screenshot, timestamp, save. The contrast between my reality and their digital illusion was jarring. I sat in a freezing apartment wearing a worn-out sweater, typing lines of code while my family drained an illicit windfall across the Atlantic. But the sting of rejection was gone. Every photo Lexi uploaded was not a personal insult. It was a receipt. They were publicly documenting the exact trajectory of the stolen funds. They were handing the title insurance investigators a perfect chronological map of their fraud. Back in Michigan, my parents were busy crafting their own fictional narrative. Grand Rapids society is small, and word of a real estate transaction travels fast among the country club crowd. People knew my grandmother left me the cabin. People knew I loved that property. My parents had to explain why it was suddenly sold and why the proceeds were currently funding my sister's extravagant holiday. They did not admit the truth. They spun a lie that elevated them and degraded me. I learned about their country club gossip through a mutual friend who felt guilty enough to call me. According to David and Susan, I was drowning in undisclosed debt. They told their golf partners and tennis friends that I had begged them to sell the lake house because I could not afford the property taxes and upkeep. They painted themselves as the generous saviors stepping in to manage a financial crisis created by my own irresponsibility. Susan told the ladies at her weekly brunch that I willingly handed over the equity. She claimed I wanted Lexi to have the money because I felt guilty for being such a burden on the family. They transformed my quiet independence into a pathetic failure. They needed me to look broken so their golden child could shine brighter. I did not defend myself. I did not correct the rumors. I let my parents hold court at the country club boasting about their real estate savvy. I let them soak up the praise and admiration of their peers. Pride always precedes a harsh fall, and David was standing on the edge of a very steep cliff. My mother grew bolder with my silence. She started sending me text messages disguised as maternal concern but laced with poison. "Hope you are settling into a sensible apartment, Brooke. It is better to live within your means," she texted on a Tuesday morning. Lexi is having the time of her life in Greece. Brad booked a private helicopter tour over Santorini today. Your father and I are so proud of how well he provides for her. We hope you can find that kind of stability someday. I read the text while sipping bitter black coffee from a paper cup. She wanted a reaction. She craved the drama of me fighting back so she could call me bitter and jealous. I took a screenshot of her text message. I saved it to the encrypted folder right next to the photograph of Brad standing next to the rented helicopter in Santorini. I replied with a single sentence, "I'm glad they are enjoying the trip, Mom." My strategy was pure documentation. I became a digital ghost, silently cataloging every piece of evidence. I tracked the fluctuating exchange rates to estimate the daily cost of their villas. I noted the brand names of the luxury watches Brad purchased in Milan. I archived the geotags from the Michelin star restaurants they visited in Paris. The folder grew larger every single day, filled with high-resolution proof of grand larceny. But the foster family dynamic thrives on total subjugation. It was not enough for them to steal my inheritance and flaunt it across Europe. It was not enough for my parents to ruin my reputation among their wealthy social circle. My quiet acceptance of their narrative unsettled them. My lack of tears frustrated them. They needed to see me suffer to validate their choices. I thought keeping my distance would protect my professional life. I thought my career as a UX designer was the one safe harbor they could not touch. I had built a solid reputation at my tech firm, and the recent Chicago integration proved my value to the executive board. My job was my sanctuary, my steady income, and my future. I did not realize that while I was meticulously tracking their European spending spree, Lexi was sitting on a sun-drenched balcony in Italy plotting to burn my safe harbor to the ground. She was looking at the vast ocean, feeling invincible, and deciding that my silence was a threat she needed to neutralize. She picked up her phone and dialed a number that would shift this conflict from a quiet family feud into a vicious professional sabotage. I closed my laptop and rubbed my tired eyes, unaware that the next morning my boss would call me into his office with a very confused and deeply concerned look on his face. The tech firm where I worked occupied the top 2 floors of a renovated brick building in downtown Grand Rapids. It was a space designed for clarity. Floor-to-ceiling windows let in natural light, and the open concept desks encouraged collaboration. I loved that office. It was the one environment in my life where logic dictated the outcome. If a user interface was broken, I analyzed the data, found the friction point, and deployed a solution. The rules were predictable. On Thursday morning, I walked into the building carrying my usual black coffee. I sat down at my workstation, ready to review the final analytics from the Chicago integration. I needed the routine. I needed the predictable rhythm of clicking keys and scrolling data to distract me from the image of my sister posing on a yacht with stolen funds. But my sanctuary was about to be breached. At 10 o'clock, an email popped up on my screen. It was from Greg, the director of our department. The subject line was empty. The body of the message contained a single sentence. "Brooke, please step into my office and close the door behind you." Greg was a pragmatic man. He evaluated everything through the lens of metrics and performance. He never called closed-door meetings unless a project was failing or a client was threatening to pull a contract. Since the Chicago deployment had been a total success, a sudden feeling of dread pooled in my stomach. I locked my screen and walked across the polished concrete floor toward his glass-walled office. I stepped inside and pulled the heavy door shut. The ambient noise of the bullpen vanished. Greg was sitting behind his desk, staring at his computer monitor. He did not look up immediately. He rubbed his temples, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Sit down, Brooke," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. I sat, keeping my posture straight. "Is there an issue with the Chicago deliverables?" I asked. He shook his head. "No. The client is thrilled. Your team executed flawlessly." He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "This is not about your work. This is a personal matter. Or rather, a personal matter that someone is trying very hard to make my business." He reached forward and clicked his mouse. "I received a voicemail this morning," he explained. "It came through the main company switchboard and was routed directly to my extension. The caller flagged it as an emergency regarding one of my senior developers. I want you to listen to it." Greg pressed a key on his keyboard. The audio file began to play through his desktop speakers. First, there was the faint static of an international connection. Then a voice filled the quiet office. It was soft, breathy, and dripping with theatrical concern. "Hi, Greg. You do not know me, but I am Brooke Foster's older sister, Lexi." My heart slammed against my ribs. I froze, gripping the armrests of my chair. "I am calling from overseas because our family is facing a sudden crisis," Lexi continued, her tone wavering perfectly to simulate distress. "We really did not want to involve her employer, but my parents and I are terrified. Brooke is going through a severe mental breakdown. She has isolated herself from us and recently became embroiled in some highly questionable financial crimes back in Michigan. She is acting erratic and making dangerous decisions. We are trying to arrange professional psychiatric intervention for her. But we felt an ethical obligation to warn you. Given her high-level security clearance at your firm, you might want to suspend her system access until we can get her into a medical facility. I am so sorry to bring this burden to your door. We just want her to be safe." The recording ended with a soft click. Silence filled the room. The air felt thick and suffocating. I stared at the speaker on Greg's desk, unable to process the sheer audacity of what I had just heard. Lexi was not just enjoying a luxury vacation funded by my stolen inheritance. She was actively reaching across the Atlantic Ocean to salt the earth behind me. She was trying to destroy my reputation, my income, and my career. This was not a new tactic. When I was a sophomore in college, I secured a highly competitive summer internship at a design firm. Lexi, who had just dropped out of her communications program, was furious. that the spotlight had shifted to me. 2 weeks before my start date, an anonymous email was sent to the internship coordinator, falsely claiming I had plagiarized my entire portfolio. I almost lost the position before I could prove the metadata on my files belonged to me. Lexi always attacked my independence whenever she felt threatened. But this was different. This was not petty jealousy. This was a calculated, preemptive strike. Lexi and Brad knew they had stolen $250,000. They knew my silence was unnatural. They needed me unemployed, broke, and stripped of my professional credibility. If I had no income, I could not hire a lawyer. If I was branded as mentally unstable, no one would believe me if I ever tried to report the theft. They were building a defense strategy by framing me as a crazy, disgruntled daughter. I looked up at Greg. My hands were shaking, but I forced my voice to remain steady. "None of that is true," I said. Greg watched me for a long moment. He was a man who trusted patterns and data. He had managed me for 4 years. He knew I showed up early, never missed a deadline, and delivered clean, logical code. He looked at the audio file on his screen and then looked back at me. "I know it is not true, Brooke," he said quietly. "People having severe mental breakdowns do not successfully manage an enterprise software integration in Chicago for 3 weeks. And people committing financial crimes usually do not drive a 5-year-old sedan and pack their own lunch every day." He reached out and dragged the audio file into his digital trash bin. He emptied the trash, permanently deleting the voicemail. "I do not know what kind of toxic situation you are dealing with outside of this building." Greg continued, his voice firm and supportive. "But your job here is secure. Your access remains active. If your sister or anyone else from your family contacts this firm again, I will have our legal department send them a cease and desist letter for workplace harassment." The relief was so sudden, it almost brought tears to my eyes. "Thank you, Greg," I whispered. "Take the rest of the afternoon," he said. "Go clear your head." I left the office and rode the elevator down to the parking garage. The concrete walls echoed with the sound of my footsteps. Greg had shielded me from the professional fallout, but the psychological toll was staggering. The betrayal cut deeper than the forged deed. My parents and my sister did not just want my money. They wanted my complete destruction. They wanted me crawling back to them, begging for a place to stay so they could control me forever. I unlocked my car and climbed into the driver's seat. I locked the doors, shutting out the world. I pulled my phone from my purse and dialed Thomas Caldwell. He answered on the second ring. "Caldwell speaking." "They are escalating," I told him, my voice echoing in the quiet car. "My sister just tried to get me fired. She called my boss from Italy and told him I was unstable and committing financial crimes. She tried to get my security access revoked." Caldwell did not sound surprised. A soft hum of approval vibrated through the phone. "Excellent," he murmured. "Excellent," I repeated, gripping the steering wheel. "Thomas, she almost cost me my job. She is panicking." "Ms. Foster," Caldwell replied, his tone clinical and sharp. "People who believe they have executed a flawless crime do not call their victim's employer to plant seeds of doubt. She is trying to discredit you because Brad realizes they left a loose end. They are attempting to control the narrative before the narrative catches up to them, but it is already too late." "What do you mean?" I asked. Caldwell paused, allowing the weight of his next words to land perfectly. "I have been monitoring the county clerk database and maintaining contact with my colleagues in the real estate sector. Your father and brother-in-law made a fatal error during their little transaction." He explained the mechanics of the trap. When David sold the cabin to the new family, the closing attorney submitted the paperwork to a title insurance underwriter. The underwriter is required by federal law to verify the chain of custody for the property. David provided a quitclaim deed that contained your forged signature, supposedly transferring the property from your name back to his. "But my name is not on the deed," I said, the realization dawning on me. "Exactly," Caldwell replied, his voice carrying a rare hint of satisfaction. "Your name has not been on that deed for a month. The property belongs to our Detroit corporate entity. The document David forged was structurally impossible. The title insurance fraud division flagged the discrepancy this morning. The system recognized that a private citizen attempted to sell a commercial corporate asset using counterfeit personal signatures. My breath caught in my throat. So what happens now? Now we let them burn, Caldwell said. The title company has frozen the escrow accounts. The new buyers are currently residing in a house they do not legally own. Within a matter of days, corporate litigators will file a formal inquiry. Your father just triggered an avalanche and he is standing right at the bottom of the mountain. I leaned my head back against the headrest, staring at the concrete ceiling of the parking garage. The trap was officially set. My father thought he had robbed a defenseless daughter. Instead, he had defrauded a multi-million-dollar corporation. But Caldwell was not finished. There is one more thing, Brooke, he added, his tone shifting from professional satisfaction to grim reality. Our private investigators pulled some preliminary background data on Brad to understand his motive. We needed to know why a junior finance analyst was desperate enough to risk federal prison for a lake house. Did you find something? I asked. Caldwell sighed. We found everything. And when your sister returns from her luxury vacation, she is going to discover that the man she married is hiding a secret that will tear their perfect life to shreds. The line went quiet, leaving me bracing for the next devastating revelation. The drive back to Detroit the following morning felt different. The freezing rain from the previous night had cleared, leaving behind a sharp, cloudless sky. I parked my sedan in the underground garage of the glass skyscraper and took the elevator up to the 40th floor. The polished mahogany doors of the law firm parted, and a receptionist directed me straight back to the corner office. Thomas Caldwell was already waiting for me. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the river, holding a thick manila folder. He did not offer small talk. He turned away from the glass and walked to his desk. He dropped the heavy folder onto the dark wood. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. Take a seat, Brooke, he said, gesturing to the leather chair opposite him. You are going to want to read this carefully. I sat down and pulled the folder toward me. I opened the cover. The pages inside were filled with financial spreadsheets, bank statements, wire transfer logs, and background check summaries. It was a comprehensive forensic audit. What is all this? I asked, scanning a page filled with highlighted transaction dates. That is the anatomy of a con, Caldwell replied, leaning back in his chair. When the title insurance company flagged the forged deed, I had my private investigators dig into your brother-in-law. I needed to understand his risk profile. Men who forge federal documents to steal real estate do not act out of greed alone. They act out of survival. Brad was not stealing to build wealth. He was stealing to stop himself from drowning. I looked up from the papers. Drowning in what? Debt, Caldwell said, his voice flat and clinical. Catastrophic, unmanageable debt. He instructed me to turn to the third page of the dossier. I flipped the heavy paper and stared at a summary of shadow brokerage accounts. For years, Brad had played the role of a Wall Street titan for my family. He drove the leased Porsche. He wore the vintage watches. He paid for expensive dinners at the country club, leaving generous tips to ensure everyone noticed his success. But it was nothing more than a carefully constructed costume. Brad was a junior analyst. His actual salary barely covered the payments on his luxury car and his high-end wardrobe. To bridge the gap between his modest income and his extravagant taste, he turned to aggressive day trading. He chased volatile tech stocks and leveraged his positions in unregulated cryptocurrency markets. He wanted to be a millionaire overnight. Instead, he lost everything. But he did not stop when his bank accounts ran dry. Caldwell pointed to a column of red numbers on the ledger. When traditional credit lines cut him off, Brad sought liquidity in darker waters. He borrowed heavily from unregulated hard money lenders. These were not banks. These were organizations that charged astronomical interest rates and utilized intimidation to ensure prompt repayment. Brad owed them more money than he could realistically earn in a decade. My stomach turned as I read the interest percentages. He was trapped, I whispered. Worse than trapped, Caldwell corrected. Turn to the next section. I turned the page and found employment records from Brad's finance firm. Caldwell explained that as the pressure from the shadow lenders intensified, Brad made a fatal professional choice. He began skimming funds from his own corporate clients. He moved small amounts of capital from inactive accounts, attempting to cover his margin calls and keep the predators at bay. He assumed he could win the money back in the market and replace the stolen funds before anyone noticed. He was wrong. A quarterly internal audit was rapidly approaching at his firm. If the auditors discovered the missing client funds, Brad would not just lose his job. He would face immediate federal embezzlement charges and guaranteed prison time. He needed a massive injection of cash to balance his ledgers before the end of the month. He could not secure a bank loan. He had no assets of his own to sell. So he looked at the Foster family. He evaluated my parents, and he saw the perfect targets. He saw the lake house. I said, the realization hitting me with sickening clarity. Caldwell nodded. He saw an unencumbered asset worth $250,000. But more importantly, he saw your father's ego. As I sat in that high-rise office looking at the cold, hard data, I finally understood the psychology of the betrayal. My parents were so blinded by their obsession with appearances, they never asked Brad for actual proof of his wealth. They worshipped the illusion he projected. Brad knew David was desperate to feel like an insider, a wealthy patriarch playing in the big leagues. Brad used confusing financial jargon to manipulate him. He convinced my father that holding on to a stagnant piece of rural real estate was a foolish emotional decision. He pitched the sale of the cabin as a brilliant investment strategy, promising David incredible returns if he liquidated the asset and let Brad manage the proceeds. David and Susan handed over my inheritance with smiles on their faces, believing they were securing Lexi's future. They had no idea they were throwing a life preserver to a sinking criminal. "Let us look at the wire transfers," Caldwell said, tapping a pen against the desk. David finalized the fraudulent sale for $250,000. He wired the funds directly into a joint account he shared with Brad. The moment the money cleared, Brad intercepted it. Caldwell traced the path of the stolen funds. Brad funneled $150,000 into a series of shell accounts. He used that money to pay off his bookies, satisfy the predatory lenders, and quietly replenish the stolen client funds at his firm just days before the corporate audit. He saved himself from physical ruin and federal prison using my grandmother's legacy. That left $100,000 remaining. He used the rest to fund the European trip, I said, staring at the photos in the file. Exactly, Caldwell replied. The luxury vacation was never a celebration. It was an alibi. It was a glittering, expensive smokescreen. Brad needed to take Lexi to Rome and Santorini to maintain the illusion of his success. If he had canceled the trip, Lexi would have asked questions. David and Susan would have demanded to know where the real estate money went. By spending $100,000 on yachts and private villas, Brad bought their silence and their continued adoration. I closed the manila folder. The layers of deception were suffocating. Lexi was currently posing on sun-drenched balconies, bragging to her social media followers about her perfect life. She was married to a man who viewed her family as a disposable resource. Her fairy tale marriage was built entirely on wire fraud and theft. My parents had treated me like a failure, ostracizing me from the family to elevate a con artist. "Do you want to send this file to your sister?" Caldwell asked, his tone softening just a fraction. "You have the power to end her vacation today. One phone call and her reality shatters." I sat back in the leather chair and looked out the window. Below us, the city moved in a steady, predictable rhythm. I thought about the voicemail Lexi had left for my boss. I thought about her attempt to destroy my career to protect her stolen wealth. I thought about my father standing in the freezing rain, smirking as he told me my house paid for their fun. "No," I said, keeping my voice calm and steady. "I am not going to tell her. I am going to keep this locked away. Let them enjoy the yacht. Let them drink the champagne." Caldwell smiled, a thin, sharp expression of approval. "Knowledge is only a weapon if you deploy it at the exact right moment," he agreed. I left the law firm and drove back to my cramped $900 apartment. The contrast between my reality and theirs was no longer a source of pain. It was a source of profound power. I sat on my cheap air mattress, eating warm soup from a plastic bowl, while my family drained the last of the vacation funds. They thought they had won the war. They had no idea they were dancing on the deck of a sinking ship. I spent the weekend resting, organizing my code for work, and enjoying the silence of my small room. I did not check social media. I did not respond to my mother's passive-aggressive text messages. I just waited. The quiet held until Tuesday morning. I was sitting at my desk at the tech agency reviewing a user interface wireframe when the timeline Caldwell predicted finally arrived. 30 miles away, in a small municipal building, the innocent buyers of the lake house walked up to the city clerk counter. They carried architectural plans for a new kitchen and the shiny forged deed my father had handed them. They slid the paperwork across the counter, ready to begin their new life. The city clerk typed the parcel number into the Federal Registry database and hit enter. The spark ignited. The powder keg was about to blow. The quiet shattered on a Tuesday morning. The weather in Grand Rapids was crisp and clear, the kind of day that made the local golf courses look like emeralds dropped onto the landscape. I was sitting at my desk at the tech agency, writing a string of code when the trap Caldwell designed finally snapped shut. I did not have to be in the room to know exactly how it unfolded. Caldwell called me later that afternoon and provided a forensic play-by-play of the exact moment my father realized his life was over. It started 30 miles away, in a sterile municipal building. The innocent buyers, the same couple I had met in the freezing rain, walked up to the city clerk counter. They were excited. They carried a rolled-up set of architectural blueprints for a kitchen expansion and the shiny forged deed my father had handed them at closing. They placed the paperwork on the laminate counter, ready to pay the permitting fee and begin their new life on the lake. The city clerk, an ordinary government employee earning a modest salary, took the deed. She typed the parcel number into the Federal Registry database and pressed enter. She expected the screen to validate the new owners. Instead, the monitor flashed a stark red warning. The system locked. The deed they presented, signed by David and notarized by a shady contact of Brad, contradicted the secure county registry. The registry clearly showed the property belonged to the heavily fortified corporate trust Caldwell had established. The clerk frowned. She scanned the document again, assuming a clerical error. She called her supervisor. The supervisor took one look at the discrepancy and picked up the phone. They dialed the title insurance company. Title insurance? Underwriters do not handle discrepancies with polite customer service calls. When their system detects a counterfeit transfer involving $250,000, they treat it as an active financial attack. The underwriter immediately froze the buyer's escrow accounts. They locked down the transaction and dispatched their fraud division. This division is not composed of friendly mediators. It consists of cutthroat corporate litigators whose sole purpose is to hunt down and dismantle anyone who attempts to defraud their institution. While the buyers stood at the clerk counter in total shock, David was enjoying a pristine morning at his country club. He was standing on the 14th green holding a custom putter. He was surrounded by his usual group of affluent friends. For the past week, he had been holding court, bragging about his real estate acumen. He told anyone who would listen how he had expertly liquidated a stagnant family asset to fund his daughter's extravagant European tour. He felt like a king. He felt untouchable. His cell phone rang in his golf cart. David checked the screen, expecting to see a text from Lexi in Rome or a call from his stockbroker. Instead, he saw an unknown corporate number. He answered the call with his usual booming, confident voice. He expected to network. He expected to negotiate. The voice on the other end of the line did not belong to a friend. It belonged to Jonathan Reed, a senior litigator for the Title Insurance Fraud Division. "Mr. Foster," Jonathan asked, his tone sharp and entirely devoid of warmth. Speaking, David replied, waving his friends to go ahead and putt without him. "My name is Jonathan Reed. I represent the Fraud and Compliance Division of the Title Insurance Underwriter handling the recent transaction on the lakefront property. We are contacting you regarding the federal closing documents you submitted last week." David chuckled, a deep, patronizing sound. He still thought he was in control. "What seems to be the issue, Jonathan? Did I forget to dot an I or cross a T on page 4? You did not forget a signature, Mr. Foster." Jonathan replied, the chill in his voice dropping the temperature of the conversation. "You submitted a forged quitclaim deed. You collected $250,000 for a property you do not legally own. David froze. His grip on the putter tightened. His friends were laughing near the hole, oblivious to the destruction happening a few feet away. "Excuse me," David stammered, his confident boom shrinking into a tight, raspy whisper. "That is my daughter's house. I had full authorization." "You had authorization from Brooke Foster," Jonathan corrected. "But Brooke Foster does not own the property. The parcel belongs to a commercial real estate holding company based in Detroit. You bypassed our security protocols and falsified a federal transfer document to steal a corporate asset. We have frozen all associated accounts. We are initiating a formal inquiry for title fraud, wire fraud, and grand larceny. You will be receiving a summons by the end of the day. We advise you to retain criminal defense counsel immediately." The call ended. David stood on the manicured grass of the country club staring at his phone. The panic was instantaneous and total. The smirk he wore on my porch, the smug satisfaction he carried for the past week, it all evaporated. The walls of his comfortable, arrogant life buckled under the weight of a single phone call. He realized in that terrible, silent moment that he had not outsmarted his meek, quiet daughter. He had not pulled one over on a naive 28-year-old girl. He had walked blindly into a trap and committed a felony against an entity with endless legal resources. He had stolen money from a corporation that could crush him without a second thought. His legs gave out. He dropped his expensive putter onto the green. His friends turned around, their laughter fading as they saw his pale, sweating face. They asked if he was having a heart attack. In a way, he was. His entire identity was dying right there on the 14th hole. When Caldwell finished telling me the story, I sat at my desk and looked out the window of the tech agency. The sky over Grand Rapids was a brilliant, clear blue. I felt a profound sense of closure. The first domino had fallen, and the chain reaction was unstoppable. David could not charm his way out of a federal inquiry. He could not bully a corporate lawyer into dropping the charges. He was trapped in a cage of his own making. But the foster family dynamic is built on a foundation of fierce denial. My parents have spent their entire lives avoiding accountability by shifting the blame onto someone else. David did not drive straight to a defense attorney. He did not call the police to confess. He threw his golf clubs into the back of his truck and sped home to Susan. They sat in their pristine living room surrounded by imported furniture and expensive art, realizing that Brad and his shady notary friend had not provided a foolproof shield. They were exposed. They were facing imminent financial ruin and potential prison time. The stolen money was already gone, spent on yachts and luxury villas by a son-in-law who was drowning in his own criminal debt. They needed a scapegoat. They needed someone to fix the unfixable. They needed the one person they had spent their entire lives underestimating and discarding. They believed they could still manipulate the system. They thought if they could just get me to sign a piece of paper validating the sale, the corporate litigators would back off. They assumed the old rules of our family still applied. They thought my silence over the past few weeks was a sign of weakness, a sign that I was waiting for them to tell me what to do. I left the office at 5 o'clock and drove back to my cramped apartment. I walked up the concrete stairs, unlocked the sticky deadbolt, and stepped inside. The room smelled like stale air and cheap carpet. I set my bag on the folding table and opened my laptop to check the encrypted folder. Lexi had posted a new photo from a vineyard in Tuscany. The caption read, "Wine tasting with my handsome husband. Life is perfect." I smiled at the screen. Life was about to become very complicated for her handsome husband. My cell phone buzzed on the table, vibrating against the cheap plastic. I looked down at the screen. The caller ID flashed a name I had not spoken to since the day of the will reading. It was Susan. My mother rarely called me. She preferred to communicate through passive-aggressive texts or relay messages through David. A direct phone call meant she was desperate. It meant David had returned from the golf course in a panic and told her the corporate lawyers were circling. I let the phone buzz. I watched the screen light up the dark room. I knew exactly what she was going to say. She was going to demand compliance. She was going to use every weapon in her emotional arsenal to force me into saving them. She was going to try and extort a retroactive signature to cover up their felony. I reached out and pressed the green button. I brought the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I just listened to the sharp, frantic breathing on the other end of the line, waiting for the next conflict to begin. I pressed the green button on my phone and brought the device to my ear. I did not say hello. I just sat in the dim light of my cramped apartment, listening to the cellular static. With my free hand, I reached across my folding table and clicked the audio recording software I had installed on my laptop earlier that afternoon. A small red circle appeared in the corner of my screen. The timer began to count upward. Every word spoken from this moment forward was going to be archived as permanent digital evidence. "Brooke," my mother's voice came through the speaker. "Are you there?" Her tone was shrill. It lacked the smooth, practiced cadence she usually deployed at her country club luncheons. Beneath the forced sweetness, I could hear the jagged edge of pure panic. Susan Foster was a woman who treated social standing as her primary armor. She viewed her children as extensions of her own resume. Lexi was the trophy she displayed to her friends. I was the liability she constantly tried to manage. Whenever David created a mess, Susan was the designated cleaner. She operated on the belief that any scandal could be buried if you threw enough money or enough guilt at the problem. "I am here, Mom," I replied, keeping my voice even. "We have a slight situation," she began, her words rushing together. "It is nothing serious, just a small clerical error regarding the lake house. The county clerk made a mistake with the filing last week. I watched the audio waveform on my screen rise and fall with her lies. A mistake I asked playing dumb to draw her out. A mistake with the house you already sold." She cleared her throat, trying to maintain the facade of a minor inconvenience. "Yes, well, the paperwork was processed incorrectly. We are just trying to protect the family assets. We need you to come down to a notary this evening. We have a document for you to sign. A retroactive quitclaim deed. It is just a simple formality to clear up the clerical error so the new buyers can get their renovation permits." I leaned back in my chair. The sheer audacity of her request was staggering. She wanted me to drive to a corrupt notary and forge a backdated legal document. She wanted me to willingly implicate myself in a federal crime to cover up the felony my father and my brother-in-law had already committed. She expected me to risk my own freedom to save the men who had just robbed me. "Why would I sign a deed for a house that is no longer mine?" I asked, keeping my tone conversational. "You sold it, Mom. You told everyone at your club that I begged you to sell it." The sweet tone vanished. The mask slipped, revealing the desperation underneath. "Brooke, this is not the time to be difficult," she snapped. "The title insurance company is asking questions. Your father is very stressed. We need to present a unified front. Brad has a guy downtown who can stamp the paperwork tonight. He will backdate the signature. Nobody has to know. Just get in your car and meet us." I needed her to say it out loud. I needed the extortion recorded in crystal clear audio. "Let me understand this," I said, staring at the red recording dot on my laptop. "You want me to sign a fake document to trick a corporate title insurance underwriter. You want me to help you hide the fact that Dad forged my signature." The silence on the line was heavy. She knew I had cornered her. She knew I understood exactly what they had done. When Susan lost control of a narrative, she resorted to her favorite weapon. Weaponized guilt. "If you do not sign this, your father could go to jail," Susan screamed. The volume of her voice spiked the audio waveform on my computer monitor straight into the red zone. The polished society woman was gone, replaced by a cornered predator. "He is facing a federal inquiry, Brooke," she yelled, her breath hitching. "Do you have any idea what that means for us? We will lose our standing. We will lose the house. You are tearing this family apart over a piece of property you did not even deserve. Grandma was foolish to leave it to you in the first place. You do not appreciate family. You only care about yourself." I let her scream. I did not interrupt. I just watched the timer on the recording software tick higher. Every insult, every admission of guilt, every frantic threat was safely captured on my hard drive. When the guilt trip failed to provoke a response, she pivoted to extortion. She brought out the heavy artillery she had used to control me since childhood. "If you walk away from us tonight, you will be dead to this family," Susan hissed. "I will call your Aunt Martha. I will call the cousins in Ohio. I will tell them you stole from us. I will tell them you orchestrated this entire nightmare to ruin your sister. You will not be welcome at another holiday dinner. And your father and I will rewrite our estate trust tomorrow morning. We will ensure you do not see a single dime of our money when we are gone. You will be entirely ostracized." She waited for my surrender. For 28 years, the threat of isolation was enough to make me yield. When I was a teenager, she used the exact same tactic to force me to give up my coding camp so I could attend Lexus cheerleading competitions. She conditioned me to believe that my survival depended on her approval. She thought the threat of losing my inheritance would terrify me. But her threats were hollow. I already knew the truth. They had no money left to leave me. David was about to have his pension seized and his assets frozen by corporate litigators. Brad had drained whatever liquidity they possessed to pay off shadow lenders. The inheritance she was dangling over my head was an illusion. And as for being ostracized from the extended family that was no longer a threat, it was an escape plan. I wanted out of the foster family hierarchy. She was promising me exactly what I desired. "Are you listening to me, Brooke?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "We are your family. You owe us. You need to fix this right now." I reached out and hovered my cursor over the stop button on the recording software. I felt a profound sense of peace settle over my shoulders. The freezing rain from weeks ago was a distant memory. The quiet, disregarded sister no longer existed. I had evolved into something they could no longer manipulate. "I cannot sign it, Mom," I said, my voice calm and perfectly steady. "Why not?" she demanded. "Are you really this vindictive? Do you want to see your own father in a prison cell?" I smiled, knowing she could not see it, but hoping she could hear the shift in my demeanor. "I cannot sign the quitclaim deed because I do not own the lake house," I replied. "What are you talking about?" Susan snapped. "Of course you own it. Grandma left it to you." I shook my head, ignoring the stale smell of my cheap apartment. "Grandma left it to me. But I transferred the deed weeks before I left for Chicago. I put the property into a commercial entity. The house you and Dad sold belongs to a corporate real estate developer in Detroit." The line went dead quiet. The only sound was the faint hum of cellular static. "It is not mine to sign anymore," I said, delivering the final blow. "You did not steal from me, Mom. You stole from them, and they do not negotiate with forgers." I lowered the phone from my ear and pressed the red button to end the call. The recording software on my laptop screen stopped counting. I clicked save, locking the audio file into the encrypted folder right next to the photographs of my sister holding champagne flutes on the Amalfi Coast. The silence in my cramped $900 apartment felt different now. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive quiet of a discarded daughter hiding from her family. It was the sharp, clear silence of a trap snapping perfectly shut. Before we dive into the explosive climax of this conflict, let me step out of the story for just a second. I need to ask you something directly. Picture yourself in my shoes. You are sitting alone in a cheap rental apartment eating instant noodles. You are staring at a computer monitor that holds the key to your own vindication. Your mother just called you not to apologize for stealing your inheritance, not to check on your well-being, but to demand that you commit a federal crime. She ordered you to forge a legal document to protect the very men who robbed you and tried to orchestrate your professional ruin. What would you do? Would you cave to the pressure? Would you listen to that ingrained childhood conditioning telling you to keep the peace and save your father from a prison cell? Or would you hold your ground and let the corporate lawyers tear their fraudulent lives apart? Drop your answer in the comments right now. Type A for save them. Type B for let it burn. I read every single comment and I want to know how you would handle this exact level of betrayal. If you chose A, I want you to know I do not judge you. I spent 28 years of my life choosing A. Keeping the peace is a phrase every family scapegoat knows intimately. It sounds noble. It sounds like maturity and sacrifice. But in a toxic household, keeping the peace merely means absorbing the war. It means setting yourself on fire to keep your abusers warm. I remember being 16 years old. Lexi had just received her driver license and she backed my father's car into the garage door, splintering the expensive wood. She was terrified David would revoke her driving privileges right before her junior prom. Susan pulled me into the kitchen and told me to take the blame. She said I needed to tell David I was the one who moved the car to wash it. She promised it would save the family a weekend of endless screaming. I chose to keep the peace. I took the blame. David grounded me for a month and Lexi went to her dance without ever saying thank you. That is what choosing A looks like. It is a slow, steady erosion of your own reality to maintain their comfortable illusion. You absorb their mistakes so they never have to experience discomfort. But if you chose B, you understand the breaking point. You realize that a biological title like mother or father does not grant an automatic license for extortion. You recognize that protecting abusers only empowers them to find new ways to destroy you. You finally comprehend that you cannot heal in the same environment that broke you. If you have ever sat across from a relative who demanded your silence to cover up their toxicity, hit that subscribe button right now. We are building a community of people who refuse to be quiet anymore. Your support tells the algorithm that these stories matter, and it helps me bring more of these experiences to light. We have reached the point of no return in this story, and the way the foster family falls apart is going to be spectacular. Let us get back to the timeline. I knew the playbook my parents operated from. Susan failing to extort me over the phone was not the end of the battle, it was merely the failure of their diplomatic channel. When the guilt trip collapsed, they always escalated. They would pivot from manipulation to bribery. They would send the man who created the mess in the first place to close the deal. I spent the next 2 days working from my apartment, ignoring a barrage of frantic voicemails from David. The tone of his messages shifted drastically from angry commands to pathetic bargaining. He offered to buy me a new car. He offered to pay my rent for an entire year. He promised to send me on my own luxury vacation anywhere in the world. He was throwing pennies at a $250,000 problem. He thought he could buy his way out of a federal indictment with empty promises. I did not return a single call. I forwarded every voicemail directly to Thomas Caldwell. The corporate litigators in Detroit were moving with breathtaking speed. They officially filed the injunction against David, freezing all of his personal bank accounts and placing a temporary lien on his primary residence. The local authorities were notified of the forged notary stamp, initiating a separate criminal investigation. The net was pulling tight around the country club patriarch. Over in Europe, the luxury vacation hit a sudden brutal wall. Brad had intercepted the frantic calls from David while sitting in a private villa in Tuscany. The timeline Caldwell mapped out was coming to fruition. Brad realized his perfect crime had triggered a corporate lawsuit that he could not outrun. The champagne stopped flowing. The yacht charters were abruptly canceled. He had to stop the hemorrhaging before the title insurance investigators uncovered his shadow loans and his embezzlement at his own finance firm. Brad did what cowards always do. He ran. He told Lexi he had an emergency client meeting back in the States that required his immediate physical presence. He lied to his own wife, leaving her stranded in a foreign country while he scrambled to save his own skin. He booked a red-eye flight back to Michigan, leaving Lexi to manage the rest of the Italian itinerary alone. He thought he could succeed where Susan had failed. He thought his background in high-level finance and his natural arrogance would allow him to intimidate me into signing the retroactive deed. He did not realize he was flying back to a war zone he could not win. I was sitting in a small, independent coffee shop near my office on a Thursday afternoon. The weather outside was gray and threatening more rain. I had my laptop open, reviewing a wireframe for a new client project. I chose this specific cafe because it was public, well-lit, and filled with witnesses. I knew Brad was back in the country. Caldwell had tracked his flight manifest. I knew it was only a matter of hours before he tracked me down. The bell above the glass door chimed, cutting through the low hum of conversation and the hiss of the espresso machine. I looked up from my screen and saw him. The golden son-in-law had returned. But he did not look like the Wall Street titan anymore. The polished veneer was entirely gone. His expensive designer clothes were wrinkled and stained from the long flight. He had dark circles under his eyes and his jaw was covered in unkempt stubble. He moved with a frantic, nervous energy, scanning the room until his eyes locked onto my table. He spotted me in the corner booth and marched over. He did not carry a briefcase or a polite smile. He carried a thick, bulging manila envelope. He slid into the booth across from me, the leather seat creaking under his weight. He smelled of stale airplane cabin air and sheer desperation. The final negotiation was about to begin, and I was holding all the cards. The leather cushion of the booth let out a long sigh under his weight as Brad sat down heavily across from me. He did not bother taking off his damp raincoat. Drops of water clung to the lapels of his designer suit. The fabric was wrinkled and carried the distinct stale odor of a transatlantic flight mixed with cheap airport coffee. This was a man who prided himself on projecting effortless wealth. He spent hours curating his image to ensure every hair was in place and every accessory signaled success. Now his hands were shaking as he gripped the edge of the table. The confident yacht owner from the Italian coast was entirely gone. He was replaced by a cornered animal trying to navigate a trap he did not understand. He did not offer a greeting. He bypassed small talk entirely and reached inside his coat pocket. He pulled out a thick manila envelope and dropped it onto the table. It landed with a heavy, muffled thud between my ceramic coffee mug and my open laptop. He slid it slowly across the wooden surface until the edge touched my keyboard. $10,000, Brooke, he said, his voice kept low to avoid the attention of the barista wiping the counter nearby. Cash, unmarked bills. It is yours right now. I looked down at the envelope. I did not reach for it. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I looked back up at his face, noting the dark bags under his eyes and the frantic pulse beating in his neck. You flew all the way back from Europe to hand me an envelope in a coffee shop, I asked, my tone mild and inquisitive. Where is Lexi? He waved his hand, dismissing the question as if his wife was an irrelevant detail. Lexi is finishing the tour. I had an emergency client situation here in the States, but that does not matter right now. What matters is solving this ridiculous family miscommunication. Your parents are a wreck. David is terrified. Susan is practically making herself sick over this property dispute. We need to put out the fire. He leaned closer, lowering his voice another octave. He was attempting to switch into his familiar role of the savvy financial fixer, the guy who steps in to handle the messy details for the people he considers beneath his intellect. Take the money, he urged, gesturing to the envelope. It is more than enough to cover your rent in that terrible apartment for a year. Buy yourself some new furniture, take a vacation. All you have to do is sign a single document validating the sale of the cabin and call off those corporate lawyers in Detroit. You tell them it was a misunderstanding and you drop the inquiry. We all walk away clean. He truly believed his own pitch. He operated in a world where every problem had a price tag and every person possessed a breaking point. He calculated my worth and decided $10,000 was my ceiling. He assumed the quiet UX designer who drove an old sedan would see a stack of $100 bills and forget the fact that she had been robbed of a $250,000 inheritance. He thought I was desperate enough to take pennies on the dollar to bail out the thief. I picked up a wooden stir stick and began slowly circling it through my black coffee. I watched the dark liquid swirl in the cup. I did not say a word. My silence unsettled him more than shouting ever could. For years, Brad controlled every conversation by dominating the airspace. He filled the room with financial jargon and boastful anecdotes to ensure nobody else had a chance to speak. When you refuse to engage with a narcissist, they quickly lose their equilibrium. They need your reaction to chart their next move. Without it, they spiral. The polite negotiator vanished. His face flushed a dark, angry red. The facade of the helpful brother-in-law crumbled away, exposing the vicious predator underneath. He leaned halfway across the table, invading my personal space. "Do not push me, Brooke," he hissed, his words sharp and jagged. "You think you are playing some brilliant game of chess right now. You think hiring a fancy Detroit law firm makes you untouchable. It does not. I work with legal teams every single day. I have litigators on retainer who make your guys look like public defenders." He pointed a shaking finger at my face. If you do not sign that paper today, I will drag your name through the mud. I will tie you up in civil court for the next 10 years. I will sue you for defamation, emotional distress, and tortious interference. I will bankrupt you with legal fees before this even reaches a judge. You will be living on the street. I kept stirring my coffee. The rhythm was steady and calm. His threats were a hollow echo of Susan from the night before. They all relied on the same broken strategy. When bribery failed, they resorted to terror. But you cannot terrorize someone who holds the winning hand. You are going to look like a fool, he continued, his voice rising just enough to draw a brief glance from a woman reading a book at the next table. You have zero proof of anything. It is your word against mine and your father's. You cannot prove I forged a single letter on that deed. It is a, he said, she said, dispute over a family asset. The courts will laugh you out of the room. He sat back, breathing heavily, waiting for the threat of endless litigation to break my resolve. He thought the lack of a smoking gun was his ultimate shield. He thought the crime was buried perfectly. I placed the wooden stir stick on a napkin. I picked up my coffee mug and took a slow, deliberate sip. The dark roast was bitter and hot. I set the mug down and met his frantic gaze. I do not have to prove anything, Brad, I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, chilling register. He frowned, his confidence faltering for a fraction of a second. What does that mean? It means you are fighting the wrong war, I explained. You think you are fighting a civil dispute against a quiet sister-in-law. But I am not the plaintiff. The title insurance underwriter is the plaintiff. And title companies do not rely on he said, she said arguments. They rely on forensic evidence. I watched the color drain out of his cheeks. When the city clerk flagged the deed on Tuesday, the underwriter immediately pulled the original closing documents. I continued delivering the facts with clinical precision. They did not just look at the signatures, Brad. They deployed their forensic handwriting analysts. They subpoenaed my state-issued identification, my tax returns, and my employment contracts to establish a verified baseline of my signature. Brad stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He was not breathing. Then they analyzed the signature you and David provided, I said. They checked the pen pressure. They checked the stroke angles. They checked the notary logs from your shady contact downtown. The forensic report concluded with total certainty that the signature on the quitclaim deed was a counterfeit. The federal case is already in motion. The FBI field office in Grand Rapids received the referral this morning. The air seemed to leave the coffee shop. The ambient noise faded into a dull roar. Brad sat frozen in the booth. A single drop of sweat rolled down his temple, tracking a line through the unkempt stubble on his jaw. The realization of his impending destruction washed over him in a visible wave. His $10,000 bribe was worthless. His threats of civil litigation were laughable. He was not facing a family argument. He was facing a federal indictment for wire fraud and forgery. You stole from a billion-dollar corporate entity, I whispered, leaning forward just an inch. They are going to tear your life down to the studs. And there is not a single document in the world I can sign to stop them. I closed my laptop and slid it into my messenger bag. I stood up from the booth, leaving my half-empty coffee cup on the table. I looked down at the manila envelope still resting near his trembling hands. Keep the cash, Brad, I said, adjusting the strap of my bag on my shoulder. You are going to need it for the commissary account. I turned and walked toward the exit. I did not look back as I pushed through the glass door and stepped out into the cool afternoon air. The predators had officially become the prey, and they were suffocating in the trap they built themselves. But the victory felt incomplete. Cornering Brad in a coffee shop was satisfying, but it left Lexi and David out of the equation. They were all complicit in this nightmare. They all played a role in the deception. Lexi was still in Europe pretending her life was a fairy tale. David was hiding in his country club mansion pretending he was a victim of circumstance. Susan was spinning lies to anyone who would listen. I unlocked my car and sat in the driver's seat. I realized I could not let them process this disaster in isolation. I could not allow them to coordinate their lies and build a false narrative to protect themselves. They needed to face the truth simultaneously. They needed to see the destruction of their hierarchy in real time. I pulled out my phone and drafted a short direct email. I addressed it to my parents, my sister, and my brother-in-law. I needed an audience for the final act. I needed a digital confrontation where nobody could hide and nobody could twist the facts. I typed a date, a time, and a simple meeting link. I was about to drop a bomb that would shatter the Foster family permanently. I returned to my cramped apartment and set my messenger bag on the floor. The gray afternoon light filtered through the single window, casting long shadows across the cheap carpet. I sat down at my folding table and opened my laptop. The digital clock in the corner of my screen read 5:15. I opened my email client and created a new message. I added David, Susan, Lexi, and Brad to the recipient list. The subject line required precision. It needed to be irresistible bait. I typed 4 words: resolving the lake house. In the body of the email, I pasted a secure video conference link and added a single sentence: I am ready to resolve the issue. Please join the room now. I hit send. I clicked the link and entered the digital meeting room. My webcam flickered to life, showing my face illuminated by the cool glow of the monitor. The background behind me was just a blank beige wall. I sat in silence, waiting to see who would take the bait first. The notification chime rang within 40 seconds. A prompt appeared on my screen, signaling that David and Susan were in the waiting room. 10 seconds later, a second chime rang for Brad. A minute after that, a third chime signaled Lexi had joined from overseas. They were desperate. They abandoned whatever they were doing because they believed I had finally surrendered. I clicked admit all. The dark screen split into a grid of 4 boxes. I took a slow, deliberate breath and observed the family dynamic playing out in real time across the digital squares. In the top left box, my parents sat side by side at their formal dining room table. The crystal chandelier above them provided an expensive warm glow, but it could not hide the toll the past few days had taken. David looked aged. The confident posture he always carried was gone. His shoulders slumped and deep, heavy bags hung under his eyes. Susan sat rigidly next to him, her hands clasped tightly together on the polished mahogany wood. Her knuckles were white. She offered a tight, strained smile to the camera, pretending everything was normal. In the top right box, Lexi appeared from her hotel room in Europe. The background showed an ornate tufted headboard and heavy velvet curtains. She wore a white silk robe. She held her phone at an angle that favored her lighting, but her expression was pure annoyance. Lexi always viewed any inconvenience as a personal insult. She rolled her eyes as the connection stabilized, clearly bothered that her luxury vacation was being interrupted by a family administrative task. In the bottom left box, Brad sat alone. He was sitting in the driver's seat of his rented car, parked in some dark, anonymous lot in Michigan. The only light in his video feed came from the dashboard and the glow of his phone screen. He looked like a ghost. He did not say a word. He just stared into the camera, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. He knew what happened at the coffee shop. He knew what I was holding. He was entirely trapped, and he could do nothing but watch. The bottom right box showed my face, calm and unreadable. David cleared his throat, leaning closer to his webcam. He adjusted his collar, attempting to summon the authoritative persona he had relied on for decades. Brooke, thank God, he sighed. His voice a mixture of forced relief and lingering condescension. He was playing the fake patriarch, once again swooping in to manage a crisis. I am glad you finally came to your senses. We have a notary on standby. Let us get this paperwork sorted tonight so we can put this ugly business behind us. Lexi let out a loud, dramatic sigh from her hotel room. Yes, please hurry this up, she complained, adjusting the collar of her silk robe. It is almost midnight here in Rome, and I have an early reservation for a private vineyard tour tomorrow. I cannot spend my entire evening dealing with your stubbornness, Brooke. Just sign whatever Dad needs you to sign so we can all move on. Susan nodded vigorously beside David. We just want peace in the family, she added, her voice trembling slightly. We just want things back to normal. I looked at the grid. I looked at the people who had spent my entire life minimizing my worth, disregarding my boundaries, and treating my future as collateral for their own comfort. David wanted his status restored. Lexi wanted her unearned luxury protected. Susan wanted her perfect illusion maintained. and Brad just wanted to escape federal prison. I let their demands hang in the air. I let the silence stretch across the digital connection until the discomfort became visible. Susan shifted in her chair. David frowned, his fake relief faltering. "I am not sharing a document for me to sign, Dad," I said, my voice projecting clearly through their speakers. I watched his brow furrow in confusion. "What do you mean you are not sharing a document?" he asked. I smiled. It was the exact same smile I gave him standing in the freezing rain on my driveway weeks ago. It was the smile of a trap snapping perfectly shut. "I am sharing this," I replied. I moved my mouse and clicked the green screen share icon at the bottom of the window. My webcam feed shrank to a small thumbnail on the side of their monitors, replaced by a high-resolution document taking over the center of their screens. It was not a backdated quitclaim deed. It was a 40-page federal legal filing. The header of the document was stamped with the official seal of the corporate litigation firm in Detroit. Below the seal, the text read, "Formal complaint and demand for damages." I slowly scrolled down to the defendants section. The names were printed in bold, sharp letters: David Foster and Bradley Hayes. Then I scrolled down to the listed causes of action. The words filled the screen, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Title forgery, grand larceny, wire fraud, tortious interference with a commercial asset. Finally, I scrolled to the damages sought by the corporate plaintiff. The number sat at the bottom of the page in undeniable black text: $750,000. 50. The reaction was instantaneous. David leaned so close to his screen, his face distorted in the webcam. His eyes scanned the legal jargon tracking the devastating charges. His mouth fell open. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and hollow. He realized in that agonizing moment that the corporate lawyers were not just freezing his accounts. They were coming for everything he owned. They were demanding triple damages for the forged real estate transaction. Susan let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. She read the words "federal wire fraud" and began to hyperventilate. The country club facade crumbled into dust. Lexi stopped adjusting her silk robe. She squinted at her phone screen, her annoyance shifting into deep confusion. "Wait," she said, her voice losing its haughty edge. "What is this? Why is Brad named on a federal lawsuit? Dad, what is going on?" David could not answer her. He was frozen, staring at the destruction of his legacy. But I was not finished. The lawsuit was only the first blow. The legal filing proved the crime, but it did not expose the motive. My parents still believed they committed this felony to help their golden daughter. They still believed Brad was a successful financier who just needed a quick favor to liquidate a family asset. I needed to burn that illusion to the ground. I clicked a new tab on my browser. The federal lawsuit vanished, replaced by the financial dossier Thomas Caldwell had compiled. The spreadsheet filled the shared screen. It was a masterclass in forensic accounting, detailing the exact anatomy of Brad's shadow life. I highlighted the first column. "Look closely, Dad," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet digital room. "This is your son-in-law's real portfolio." The screen displayed a long list of catastrophic day trading losses. It showed margin calls and liquidated assets. Then I scrolled down to the most damning section of the ledger. I highlighted the shadow loans. The screen revealed a staggering $150,000 debt owed to unregulated predatory lenders. It detailed the exorbitant interest rates and the missed payments leading up to the exact week my house was sold. Brad let out a low, agonizing groan from his dark car. He dropped his head into his hands, unable to look at the screen. "He did not need the lake house money to fund a luxury vacation, Mom," I explained, tracing my cursor over the highlighted numbers. "He needed the money to save himself from loan sharks and to cover up the client funds he skimmed from his own firm." I switched the tab one last time, bringing up the wire transfer logs. The document proved the exact path of the stolen funds. It showed David wiring $250,000 into the joint account. It showed Brad immediately transferring $150,000 out to pay off his illegal gambling debts, leaving only a fraction of the theft to fund the Italian trip. The evidence sat there, undeniable and permanent. The silence in the digital room was heavy and suffocating. The tension was pulled so tight it felt like the glass on my monitor might crack. They were all staring at the screen, processing the sheer magnitude of the deception. The fuse was lit and the explosion was mere seconds away. The silence in the digital meeting room was deafening. For a long, unbroken moment, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The shared screen displaying the financial forensic dossier and the federal lawsuit acted as a digital mirror, forcing my family to look at the ugly truth they had tried so hard to bury. The 4 boxes on my monitor framed a tableau of pure shock. The air in my cramped apartment felt cool and light, while the atmosphere in their respective feeds grew suffocating. Then the chaos erupted. Lexi was the first to break the silence. Her pristine European background blurred slightly as she leaned into her phone screen, squinting at the ledger rows. For 29 years, my sister had floated through life, shielded by my parents' money and her own undeniable privilege. She structured her entire identity around being the wealthy, successful daughter. Now the spreadsheet glaring back at her proved her fairy tale was built on a foundation of theft and staggering debt. "Brad," she said, her voice losing its polished tone and dropping into a sharp, frantic octave. "What is she talking about? What is a shadow loan?" Brad sat frozen in his dark rental car. The dim glow of his dashboard illuminated the sheer terror on his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic stammer emerged. "Lexi, honey," he began, his voice cracking. "It is a misunderstanding. She is manipulating the numbers." Lexi did not believe him. She was spoiled, but she was not blind. She read the bold red text highlighting the $150,000 deficit. She saw the dates of the wire transfers lining up perfectly with the day they booked their first-class tickets to Rome. A misunderstanding. Lexi screamed, the audio peaking and distorting through my computer speakers. "The document says you owe loan sharks. It says you embezzled from your own firm." "Brad, we just bought a vintage watch in Milan yesterday. We chartered a yacht. Whose money are we spending?" Brad wiped a layer of cold sweat from his forehead. He darted his eyes away from his camera, unable to hold her digital gaze. "We are fine, Lexi," he pleaded. "I had a rough quarter in the market. I just needed to borrow some liquidity to cover a margin call. I was going to pay David back with the returns. It was a bridge loan. You stole from my sister," Lexi shrieked, her face turning a blotchy red. "You told me you earned a massive bonus. You told me we were rich." David broke his paralysis. The patriarchal ego that had defined his entire existence shattered. He stared at the screen, realizing he had not outsmarted anyone. He had been played. The man he respected, the son-in-law he bragged about to his country club friends, had used him as a disposable pawn to escape financial ruin. David realized he did not commit a felony to secure his daughter's future. He committed a federal crime to pay off a degenerate gambler. "You forged the notary documents," David whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of profound betrayal and rising fury. "You told me you had a guy downtown who could push the paperwork through legally. You promised me the title insurance underwriters would never flag a family transfer." Brad shifted his defense. When a cornered predator runs out of lies, it turns its teeth on its own allies. Brad glared at his webcam, his fear morphing into desperate viciousness. "Do not play the innocent victim, David." Brad spat back, his voice echoing in the empty rental car. "You are the one who signed her name. You are the one who took the money from the escrow account. My name is not on that fraudulent quitclaim deed. Yours is. You committed the forgery. You cannot pin this on me." David let out a primal roar of anger. He slammed his fist down on his polished mahogany dining table, causing the webcam to shake fiercely. "I signed it because you assured me the liability was covered," David yelled. "You set me up. You used my property to pay your debts. I am going to call the district attorney. I am going to tell them you orchestrated this entire scheme." "You tell them whatever you want," old man Brad sneered. "We are co-defendants on that federal lawsuit. If I go down, I am dragging you right into the cell next to me. You think your country club buddies are going to visit you in federal prison?" The wolves were tearing each other apart. The loyalty they claimed to hold, the family-first rhetoric they used to silence me for decades, disintegrated in a matter of seconds. They were not a united front. They were selfish individuals scrambling to survive the wreckage they had created. Susan could not handle the destruction of her reality. She sat next to David, gripping the edge of the dining table, her chest heaving. The illusion of her perfect, wealthy family was gone. She heard the words, "federal prison," and began to hyperventilate. She gasped for air, her face turning pale. "Stop it!" She cried out, her voice a thin, reedy wail. "Stop yelling! We can fix this!" David, call the lawyers. Brad, transfer the money back. Brooke, please tell them you will drop the lawsuit. Nobody listened to her. David and Brad continued to scream over each other, their voices tangling into a loud, unintelligible mess of accusations and threats. Lexi began sobbing hysterically in her hotel room, realizing her marriage was a fraud and her luxury vacation was about to end in a criminal investigation. I sat back in my folding chair. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I just watched the digital grid. For 28 years, I believed they were untouchable. I believed their hierarchy was carved in stone. They cast me as the failure so they could play the winners. They expected me to remain in the shadows, quietly absorbing their insults and funding their extravagant lives with my inheritance. But the moment the pressure tested their foundation, the entire structure collapsed. They possessed no loyalty. They possessed no honor. They were just greedy people fighting over the scraps of a stolen life. The noise emanating from my speakers was deafening. The screaming reached a fever pitch. Brad threatened to file for divorce. Lexi threw a glass across her hotel room, shattering it against the wall. David stood up, pacing behind his dining chair, holding his chest. I moved my mouse toward the red button at the bottom of the screen. I unmuted my microphone. I did not have to shout. The quiet, steady tone of my voice cut through their chaos like a sharp blade. "I did not do this to you," I said. The arguing faltered. David stopped pacing. Lexi looked at her phone, her face streaked with tears. Brad stared into his webcam, his jaw tight. They all looked at my square. They looked at the quiet daughter they had underestimated for their entire lives. "You did this to yourselves." I continued, delivering the final verdict. "You destroyed your own lives the very moment you decided my worth was expendable." I did not wait for their response. I did not give them a chance to beg or hurl another insult. I moved my cursor over the end meeting icon. I clicked the button. The screen instantly went black. The screaming was cut off, leaving my cramped apartment in total silence. The digital confrontation was over. I closed my laptop and let out a long, slow breath. The emotional war was finished. But ending the call only concluded the digital chapter of this nightmare. The real-world fallout was waiting just outside my door. The corporate litigators in Detroit did not care about family dynamics or tearful apologies. They cared about recovering their stolen assets and punishing the individuals who breached their security. The sun was setting over Grand Rapids, but for David, Lexi, and Brad, a much darker night was just beginning. The dominoes were lined up perfectly, and gravity was about to take over. The screen on my laptop remained dark after I ended the video call, but the machinery of consequence was already operating at full speed. The fallout from the forensic evidence was rapid, and it carried no mercy. When you introduce federal fraud into the highly regulated American financial system, the reaction is not a slow bureaucratic crawl, it is a swift and clinical amputation. Within 48 hours of that digital confrontation, the carefully constructed lives of my family members were dismantled piece by piece. The first blow landed on Brad. He built his entire identity around his career at the finance firm. He spent years cultivating the image of a rising Wall Street star, operating from a sleek glass corner office in downtown Grand Rapids. He thought his dark rental car was a safe place to hide while he figured out a legal strategy. He was wrong. On Thursday morning, Brad attempted to return to his office. He needed to access his work computer to cover his tracks and manipulate his internal client ledgers before the quarterly audit officially began. He walked through the revolving glass doors of his corporate building, wearing a fresh suit, hoping to project confidence. He approached the security turnstile and scanned his employee badge. The light on the scanner blinked red, the heavy metal gate locked in place. He tried again, tapping the plastic card against the reader. It flashed red a second time. Before he could argue with the security guard waiting near the desk, the elevator doors opened. Two men in dark suits stepped into the lobby, accompanied by the Director of Human Resources. They were not local police. They were federal compliance investigators acting on the referral generated by the Title Insurance Fraud Division. Brad did not get to return to his desk. He did not get to pack his belongings into a cardboard box. The HR director handed him a single sheet of paper detailing his immediate termination with cause. The investigators confiscated his company-issued phone and his laptop, holding them as material evidence for the pending embezzlement charges. He was escorted out of the building in full view of his colleagues. The men and women he had spent years trying to impress watched through the glass walls as he was marched out the front doors. His corporate access was revoked permanently. His license to trade securities was suspended pending investigation. The golden son-in-law walked onto the crowded city sidewalk with nothing but the suit on his back, facing a mountain of debt and a federal indictment. Thousands of miles away in Italy, the reality of the situation crashed down upon my sister. Lexi was standing in the opulent marble lobby of a five-star hotel in Rome. The air smelled of fresh espresso and expensive floral arrangements. She wore oversized designer sunglasses and carried a leather handbag purchased the day before with stolen funds. She approached the front desk intending to check out and arrange a private car transfer to the airport. She handed the concierge her black credit card, expecting the usual obsequious treatment she believed she deserved. The concierge, a man dressed in a sharp, tailored uniform, swiped the card through the terminal. He frowned, looking at the computer screen. He swiped it a second time. "I am sorry, madam," he said, his tone polite but firm. "The transaction has been declined. Do you have another method of payment?" Lexi let out an exasperated sigh, assuming it was a simple international banking error. She dug into her designer purse and produced a different credit card from a separate bank. She slid it across the marble counter. The concierge processed the second card. The terminal beeped a sharp negative tone. "Declined," he repeated. Lexi felt a cold flush of panic rise in her chest. She pulled out her phone and opened her banking application. The screen took a moment to load over the hotel wireless network. When the numbers finally appeared, she stopped breathing. Every single joint account she shared with Brad showed a balance of 0. The corporate litigators from Detroit had moved with surgical precision. Acting on the federal injunction, they had frozen all of Brad's assets. The banks holding their lines of credit had triggered emergency lockouts, citing suspected wire fraud. The wealth she had flaunted for the past 2 weeks vanished into thin air. She stood in the center of the Roman hotel lobby holding a useless piece of plastic. The concierge was staring at her, waiting for the final bill to be settled. Other wealthy guests were queuing behind her, murmuring in quiet annoyance at the delay. Lexi was forced to do the one thing she had mocked me for my entire life. She had to beg. She walked away from the desk, her face burning with humiliation. She sat on a velvet sofa in the corner of the lobby and began dialing numbers. She could not call David and Susan because their accounts were frozen as well. She had to swallow her immense pride and call the extended relatives she usually ignored. She dialed our Aunt Martha in Ohio. Lexi wept into the phone, spinning a frantic story about a stolen wallet and a banking glitch. She pleaded for a wire transfer just to cover the hotel bill and buy a commercial coach ticket back to Michigan. The woman who had chartered private yachts and mocked my small apartment was reduced to pleading for charity just to secure a middle seat on a transatlantic flight. Her fairy tale was over, leaving her stranded in the ruins of her own arrogance. Back in Michigan, the destruction of my father's legacy was even more profound. David had spent decades cultivating his image among the Grand Rapids elite. He played golf at the most exclusive country club, he attended the highest-profile charity galas, and he always ensured everyone knew the Foster family was successful. He measured his worth by the envy in the eyes of his peers. The corporate lawyers from Detroit understood exactly how to dismantle a man like David. They did not just target his bank accounts, they targeted his pride. On Friday afternoon, David was sitting in the dining room of his country club. He was trying to project an air of calm, drinking a scotch and attempting to laugh with a group of local business owners. He thought he could bluff his way through the crisis until he found a legal loophole. A man in a cheap windbreaker walked into the dining room, bypassing the host stand. He carried a thick stack of legal documents. He navigated through the tables of wealthy patrons until he stood directly in front of David. "David Foster," the man asked, holding out the papers. David set his glass down, his face tightening. "Who is asking?" "You have been served," the process server announced, his voice carrying across the quiet dining room. The man dropped the federal summons directly onto the white linen tablecloth. He turned and walked out, leaving David staring at the heavy stack of paper. The conversation at the surrounding tables stopped. The clinking of silverware ceased. The elite members of the club watched in stunned silence. The documents detailed the seizure of his assets. To cover the damages of the title forgery, the litigators had placed an immediate lien on his primary residence. The house he and Susan used to host their lavish parties was now collateral for a federal lawsuit. Furthermore, the injunction targeted his retirement pension, freezing the funds he had accumulated over 30 years of work. But the final blow to his ego came the very next morning. David received an email from the board of directors at his country club. The rumors of his federal indictment for grand larceny and wire fraud had spread through the local society faster than a wildfire. The club, a place that prided itself on prestige and untarnished reputations, acted to protect its own image. The email formally revoked his membership effective immediately. He was banned from the premises. The people he had spent his entire life trying to impress, the friends he had boasted to about his brilliant real estate maneuvers, turned their backs on him in a matter of days. When Susan went to the local luxury grocery store, her former tennis partners looked the other way, pretending not to see her in the produce aisle. Their social standing evaporated, leaving them isolated in a house they were about to lose. The narrative of the successful Foster family was entirely dead. The facade had crumbled, leaving only the ugly truth exposed for the entire world to see. I watched the fallout from the quiet safety of my cramped apartment. I read the legal updates Caldwell forwarded to my inbox. I saw the process serving receipts and the bank freeze confirmations. I felt no pity. I felt no guilt. They were experiencing the natural consequences of their own toxic choices. They had tried to sacrifice my future to maintain their comfort, and the fire they set had simply blown back in their faces. But I knew the nature of cornered animals. When predators lose their territory and their resources, they do not quietly accept defeat. They become frantic. They look for one final escape hatch. David had lost his status, his money, and his allies. He had nowhere left to turn. The legal machinery was crushing him, and he was running out of oxygen. I sat at my folding table, listening to the rain tap against my single window. I knew the silence would not last. The anger and the arrogance were gone, but desperation remained. I looked at my locked front door, anticipating the inevitable. I knew David was going to exhaust every other option, and then he was going to come looking for the daughter he threw away. 2 weeks passed in relative silence. The storm that ripped through the Grand Rapids social circles did not reach the threshold of my rental. I spent my days writing code and leading remote design meetings. My professional life flourished. Without the constant weight of my family projecting their failures onto me, my mind felt remarkably clear. I upgraded my air mattress to a real bed. I bought a few plants to place on the windowsill. The space still smelled like old carpet, but it was my sanctuary. Meanwhile, the legal machinery in Detroit continued its relentless forward momentum. Thomas Caldwell sent me brief factual updates every few days. The federal prosecutors officially impaneled a grand jury to review the wire fraud charges against Brad. The title insurance company initiated foreclosure proceedings on my parents' primary residence to recoup their stolen capital. The walls were closing in and the oxygen was running out. I knew the isolation was driving David to the brink. For his entire adult life, he relied on an audience. He needed people to applaud his success and validate his decisions. Now his phone stopped ringing. His former friends crossed the street to avoid him. Susan spent her days locked in the master bedroom, refusing to face the neighbors. Lexi was back in Michigan, living in a cheap extended stay motel while navigating her own divorce proceedings. The hierarchy they sacrificed me to protect was reduced to ashes. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon. The autumn air was turning crisp, signaling the approaching Michigan winter. I was sitting at my folding table drinking hot tea and reviewing a user interface layout. A knock sounded at my front door. It was not a confident, authoritative rap. It was a weak, hesitant sound. It sounded like someone knocking who expected to be turned away. I set my mug down. I walked across the small living room and peered through the scratched brass peephole. The man standing in the hallway barely resembled the person who had pulled his silver truck onto my driveway weeks prior. David looked like he had aged a decade in 14 days. The custom-tailored waterproof jacket was gone. He wore a faded gray sweater that hung loosely on his frame. His posture was folded inward. The broad chest and squared shoulders that used to command boardrooms and golf courses were sunken. His skin carried a pale grayish tint, and his hair remained uncombed. He looked fragile. He looked small. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door. I did not invite him inside. I stood in the doorway, blocking the threshold. "Brooke," he said, his voice cracking on the single syllable. He did not offer a patronizing greeting. He did not tell me what to do. He stood in the dim fluorescent light of the corridor and looked at me with hollow, bloodshot eyes. "What do you want, Dad?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. He shifted his weight nervously. He looked down at the cheap welcome mat beneath his worn shoes and then back up at my face. "They are going to take the house," he whispered, the words tumbling out in a rushed, frantic breath. "The lawyers sent a notice of foreclosure. They froze the pension accounts. We have nothing left, Brooke. We cannot even afford to hire a defense attorney for the criminal inquiry. The public defender told me I might face actual prison time. Susan cannot stop crying. She cannot sleep." He raised a trembling hand and ran it over his face. "Please," he begged. The word sounded foreign coming from his mouth. "Brooke, please. Just call your lawyers. Tell the trust to drop the civil suit. Tell them it was all a terrible family misunderstanding. I will sign a promissory note. I will pay you back every single cent I took. I will get a job at a hardware store. I will work for the rest of my life to make it right. Just make them stop." I stood in the doorway and watched him crumble. For years, I imagined a scenario like this. Every child who grows up assigned the role of the scapegoat harbors a secret fantasy of vindication. You dream of the day your abusers finally see the damage they caused. You picture them falling to their knees, recognizing your value and begging for your forgiveness. You assume that moment will bring a surge of triumph. You think it will heal the scars they left behind. But standing there looking at the broken shell of my father, I felt no triumph. I felt no joy. I did not feel the sudden urge to celebrate his downfall. I felt a cold, profound emptiness. The man crying in my hallway was a stranger. I realized I had been mourning the loss of a father I never actually had. The person I wanted to protect me never existed. David was just a flawed, greedy man who prioritized his own ego over his daughter's well-being. His tears were not born of remorse for hurting me. He was not apologizing for stealing my inheritance or allowing his son-in-law to orchestrate my professional ruin. He was crying because he got caught. He was begging because the consequences of his own actions were finally applying pressure to his neck. He was trying to negotiate a debt that could not be settled. He still fundamentally misunderstood the reality of the situation. "I cannot. Dad?" I said, my voice quiet and grounded in cold, hard facts. His eyes widened. The desperation in his gaze turned frantic. "What do you mean you cannot?" he pleaded, stepping half an inch closer. "You are the victim. You are the plaintiff. You can call them right now. You can tell them to drop the charges." I shook my head slowly. "I am not the plaintiff." He stared at me, uncomprehending. "You sold a piece of real estate that belonged to a commercial development firm," I explained, delivering the truth without malice or anger. "I am just a minority shareholder in that corporate trust. I hold equity, but I do not possess executive voting power. I do not command their legal department. The corporation is suing you, David. The title insurance underwriter is pursuing the criminal charges." I watched the realization slowly sink into his tired mind. "You did not steal my house." I continued, spelling out the final verdict. "You stole their asset. You defrauded a federal banking institution. You bypassed title insurance protocols. You committed grand larceny against a multi-million-dollar entity. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The frail hope he carried up the stairs to my apartment evaporated. Even if I wanted to save you, I said, letting the finality of the words settle between us. It is entirely out of my hands. They do not negotiate with people who forge corporate documents. They do not accept apologies. They only accept restitution and prison time. David took a slow, stumbling step backward. The fluorescent light flickered above him, casting long shadows across his face. He looked at me as if seeing me for the very first time. He realized the quiet daughter he discarded was the only person who could have saved him, and he had pushed her out of the lifeboat long before the ship started sinking. There was nothing left to say. The negotiations were over. The ledger was closed. I reached for the brass handle of my door. "Goodbye, Dad," I said softly. I pushed the door shut. The latch clicked into place. I turned the deadbolt, driving the heavy metal rod deep into the frame. I stood in my living room, listening to the silence. I heard the slow shuffling sound of his footsteps retreating down the hallway. I heard the stairwell door open and close. It was the last time I would ever see my father. The biological tie was severed, replaced by the unyielding boundary of self-preservation. I walked back to my folding table, picked up my hot tea, and returned to my work. The storm outside was raging, but inside my sanctuary the weather was perfectly clear. Michigan winters are brutal and unforgiving. The snow falls in thick, heavy sheets, burying everything under a suffocating layer of white. I watched the seasons change from the single window of my apartment. The ice slowly thawed, giving way to the damp green promise of spring. My life thawed right alongside it. I received a significant promotion at the tech agency, stepping into a senior design management role. I moved my workstation out of the cramped space and into a larger corner office downtown. The lingering smell of old carpet and cheap instant noodles faded from my memory. It was replaced by the scent of fresh coffee and quiet stability. The chaos of my former life felt like a distant television show I had simply stopped watching. The legal system moves with agonizing slowness, but it crushes whatever it catches in its steel gears. News of the fallout reached me through the quiet local grapevine and brief factual updates from Thomas Caldwell. Brad did not secure a high-priced defense attorney. His frozen assets meant he had to rely on an overworked public defender. He sat in a county holding cell awaiting a federal trial date. The arrogant Wall Street persona was stripped away, leaving a terrified man facing a decade of mandatory minimum sentencing. Lexi, of course, did not stand by his side. Loyalty in the foster family hierarchy was always conditional. It was based entirely on financial utility. The moment Brad's bank accounts hit zero, Lexi filed for divorce. She cited irreconcilable differences. She moved out of their expensive leased townhouse and rented a small room on the opposite side of the city. She had spent her entire life expecting to be taken care of. Our parents always cleared the path in front of her, ensuring she never had to walk on rough terrain. Now she was barefoot on gravel. She viewed marriage as an endless cash machine, and the machine had swallowed her card. On a warm Tuesday in late May, I walked down to the metal mailboxes in the lobby of my building. I turned the small brass key and pulled out a stack of utility bills and junk flyers. Hidden in the center of the mundane stack was a pale blue envelope. The paper was thick, heavy cotton. It was the kind of expensive stationery you buy when you want the recipient to feel important and obligated. My name was written across the front in a looping, elegant cursive. I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was the same handwriting that used to forge my name on my own homework assignments when we were teenagers. Lexi had somehow found my unlisted address. I carried the envelope upstairs and set it on my kitchen counter. I stared at the pale blue paper for a long time. I knew what was inside before I even broke the seal. Narcissists do not handle isolation well. When their primary sources of supply dry up, they return to the wells they previously poisoned, hoping the water has magically cleared. I boiled a kettle of water and made a cup of chamomile tea. I sat at my wooden dining table, slid my finger under the glued flap, and opened the envelope. 4 pages of dense handwriting spilled out. The narrative was meticulously crafted. It was a beautiful symphony of victimhood. Lexi spent the first 2 pages detailing the horrors of her brief marriage. She claimed Brad manipulated her from the very beginning. She painted herself as a naive, trusting wife who had no idea her husband harbored catastrophic gambling debts. She wrote about the deep humiliation of being stranded in Rome, crying in a hotel lobby while wealthy strangers stared at her. Then she pivoted. She shifted her focus to David and Susan. Lexi claimed she suddenly realized how toxic our parents truly were. She wrote that they pressured her into accepting the luxury vacation to maintain their country club appearances. She insisted she was just a helpless pawn in their twisted game of social climbing. She framed her entire existence as a tragedy orchestrated by everyone else around her. Then came the hook. The final page was dedicated entirely to me. She apologized for the emotional distance between us over the years. She said the trauma of the past few months had opened her eyes to the true value of real family. The closing paragraph was written with a heavy, trembling hand, ensuring the ink pressed deep into the cotton paper. "We are sisters, Brooke," she wrote. "We survived the same toxic house. We should stick together and rebuild our lives. I am ready to be the older sister you always deserved. Please call me. We need each other right now." It was a beautifully written apology. It hit all the correct emotional notes. It sounded vulnerable and deeply sincere. But sitting in the quiet safety of my kitchen, sipping my warm tea, I saw right through the elegant cursive. The 4 pages lacked the one crucial element required for true reconciliation. It lacked any shred of accountability. She was not apologizing for her own greed. She never once mentioned the lake house. She never acknowledged the fact that she gleefully spent $250,000 she believed was stolen directly from my hands. She was not sorry for boarding a first-class flight funded by my stolen inheritance. She was only sorry the gravy train derailed before she could finish the tour. She was apologizing because she needed a new savior. She likely saw my career advancing through mutual contacts. She recognized my growing financial stability. She wanted to attach herself to my upward trajectory because her own ship had sunk to the bottom of the ocean. For 28 years, I would have scrambled to reply to that letter. I would have felt the familiar tug of guilt pulling at my chest. I would have drafted a dozen different responses, trying to find the perfect combination of words to comfort her while protecting myself. I would have assumed the responsibility of healing her trauma because that was the role they assigned me. But the corporate litigation, the frozen bank accounts, and the digital confrontation had severed those old wires. My programming was updated. I no longer viewed her tears as my emergency. Lexi was an adult facing the natural consequences of choosing a life built on a shallow illusion. She chose the yacht. She chose the champagne. She chose the man who forged federal documents. She had to navigate the wreckage on her own. I did not feel angry. I did not feel the sharp sting of betrayal. The emotional manipulation was so transparent, it almost felt hollow. I read the letter a second time, analyzing the structure of her lies, the same way I would analyze a broken line of code. I saw the friction points. I saw the hidden malware. I folded the 4 pages neatly, pressing the creases flat against the table. I stood up and walked into my bedroom. I opened the bottom drawer of my wooden desk. I placed the pale blue envelope next to a small stack of old childhood photographs. I closed the drawer, shutting the wood with a soft, final click. I did not pick up my phone. I did not draft an email explaining my feelings or defending my position. Setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is not a punishment designed to hurt the other person. It is the simple, quiet refusal to finance someone else's dysfunction with your own hard-earned peace. The silence I offered them was no longer a tactical maneuver. The silence was permanent. The emotional war was over, and the final chapter of my new life was just beginning to unfold. 18 months is a long time in the corporate tech sector. Algorithms change, software platforms evolve. But the most profound transformation during those 18 months happened inside my own mind. The pale blue envelope remained buried in the bottom drawer of my desk, gathering dust. I never sent a reply. I never reached out to check the status of my sister's divorce or my father's public humiliation. The silence I established was not a temporary punishment. It was the permanent foundation of my new reality. The legal gears in Detroit finally stopped turning late last autumn. Thomas Caldwell called me on a crisp Friday morning. He sounded just as clinical and detached as the day we first met. The commercial real estate developer had officially settled the civil litigation. The title insurance underwriter successfully recouped their stolen capital by seizing and liquidating my parents' primary residence. The house with the polished mahogany dining table and the expensive crystal chandelier was sold at a public bank auction to a young couple from Chicago. David and Susan were forced to pack their designer clothes into plastic bags and move into a small, unrenovated duplex on the industrial edge of the county. Brad did not fare any better. He accepted a plea deal to avoid a lengthy public trial. He is currently serving a 48-month sentence in a federal correctional facility. The corporate trust, recognizing my minority shareholder status and my instrumental role in uncovering the forgery, issued a final settlement. Caldwell mailed me a certified bank draft for the exact market value of the original lake property, $250,000. I sat at my kitchen counter holding the heavy slip of paper. The numbers were printed in dark, bold ink. I knew exactly what my family would have done with this capital. David would have traded his truck for a luxury sedan to impress the neighbors at his new duplex. Lexi would have booked another European flight to capture the perfect social media aesthetic. They viewed money as a costume to wear over their insecurities. I viewed money as a tool to build an impenetrable fortress. I did not buy a sports car. I did not purchase a ticket to Rome. Instead, I drove into the neglected industrial district of downtown Grand Rapids. I spent weeks walking through empty commercial properties. I navigated cracked sidewalks and ignored the pessimistic advice of local real estate brokers. They tried to steer me towards shiny, leased offices in corporate parks. They spoke to me using the same patronizing tone my father always used, assuming the young female designer lacked the vision for heavy development. I ignored their pitches. I was hunting for a specific structure. I found it on a Tuesday afternoon. It was an old brick warehouse built in the 1920s. The roof sagged, and the tall arched windows were boarded up with rotting plywood. The interior smelled of damp concrete and decades of neglect, but the foundation was solid steel and poured cement. It was a structure designed to endure harsh conditions. I bought the building outright, paying in cash. The renovation process presented a new type of conflict. It was not a battle of emotional manipulation, but a test of sheer endurance. I encountered a city zoning inspector named Richard. He was a veteran bureaucrat who took one look at my architectural plans and decided to halt the construction. He stood in the dusty center of the warehouse wearing a hard hat and a smug smile. He told me my design for an open-concept digital studio violated a dozen obscure municipal codes. Richard folded his arms across his chest. He was accustomed to intimidating young business owners. He cited an obscure fire suppression code from 1998, claiming my interior glass partitions required a separate sprinkler grid. He handed me a clipboard with a red denial stamp hovering over my application. He expected me to panic. He expected me to slide an envelope of cash into his pocket to make the problems disappear. He reminded me so much of Brad standing in that coffee shop trying to bully his way to a victory. I did not panic. I did not offer a bribe. I pulled up the Grand Rapids Municipal Zoning Ledger on my tablet. I spent the next hour walking him through the facility, pointing out the specific grandfather clauses and historical exemptions I had already filed with the city planner. I quoted the exact building statutes, referencing the specific paragraphs that validated my design. I dismantled his bureaucratic roadblock using pure, unassailable logic. Richard lost his arrogant smile. He signed my permits the very next morning and never bothered my construction crew again. I learned that when you refuse to be a soft target, the predators quickly move on to easier prey. We tore out the rotting drywall and sandblasted the original brick. We installed floor-to-ceiling glass partitions, routing high-speed fiber optic cables through the exposed steel rafters. I applied my professional user experience logic to physical architecture. I mapped out the floor plan to eliminate creative friction, ensuring the space encouraged collaboration while protecting individual focus. Today, I am sitting in my new corner office on the second floor. The sunlight streams through the large, restored industrial windows, casting warm rectangles across my hardwood floor. I am the lead director of my own independent UX design firm. My firm specializes in designing accessible user interfaces for healthcare networks. We build systems that help people navigate complex medical data. I spend my days creating clarity out of confusion. The revenue generated by these corporate contracts is substantial, but my firm only occupies the top level of the building. I walk over to the interior glass wall and look down at the main floor. I did not build a shrine to myself. I took the remaining capital and converted the vast ground floor into a subsidized workspace, the Foster Mitchell Collective. I named it to honor my grandmother's true legacy, utilizing her maiden name alongside mine. Below me, 30 young digital artists, coders, and graphic designers are sitting at ergonomic workstations. These are women who possess incredible talent, but lack the financial backing to rent commercial studio space. They are women who were told their creative dreams were impractical. They are women who grew up in families that viewed them as afterthoughts. I provide the space, the high-speed servers, and the professional networking opportunities at a fraction of the market cost. I watch them collaborate on dual monitors, their faces illuminated by lines of code and vibrant digital illustrations. The air hums with focused energy. The sound of rapid typing blends with the low murmur of creative brainstorming. The smell of fresh espresso drifts up from the communal kitchen. There are no power struggles down there. There are no golden children and no discarded scapegoats. It is an environment built entirely on merit, mutual respect, and the relentless pursuit of independence. I am wealthy. I am secure. But most importantly, I am entirely free. My phone does not ring with demands from people who view me as an automated teller machine. My inbox is not filled with guilt trips and empty threats. The foster family hierarchy is a ghost story I no longer tell. We have reached the end of this journey. If you are watching this video and you are currently trapped in a family that uses you for spare parts, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You owe them nothing. Biological ties do not obligate you to absorb financial abuse or psychological manipulation. You do not have to endure the freezing rain on your own driveway just to prove your loyalty to people who changed the locks. You do not have to set yourself on fire to keep them warm. Let them freeze. Let them face the cold, harsh reality of their own decisions. Take your energy, your talent, and your capital, and walk away. Turn your back on the toxic dining room tables and the country club lies. Build your own life so massive and beautiful that their toxicity cannot even reach your front door. Create a space where your value is never up for debate. I am Brooke Foster. I stopped waiting for an apology that was never going to come. I stopped trying to earn the love of people who only respected leverage. I chose myself, and that was the greatest inheritance of all. Looking back at the empty building I bought 18 months ago, I realized it was never just about real estate. It was about reclaiming my own narrative. The Foster Mitchell Collective is thriving today because it stands on a foundation of mutual respect rather than manipulation. I walk through the studio every evening after the designers log off and the monitors power down. In the quiet hum of the servers, I find a profound sense of peace. The shadows of my past, the freezing rain on the driveway, the smirk on my father's face, and the frantic demands from my mother are all gone. They have been replaced by the steady rhythm of a life I built with my own two hands. People often ask me how I survived the wreckage of my biological family without losing my own identity. The truth is, surviving a toxic family requires more than just physical distance. It requires a fundamental shift in how you view yourself and the world around you. As I close this chapter of my life, I want to share the 5 crucial lessons I learned from walking away. Lesson 1 is that true wealth is not an inheritance. True wealth is independence. My parents thought stripping me of a material asset would leave me destitute and compliant. They failed to understand that my real asset was my mind, my skills, and my capacity to endure. You can rebuild a bank account, but you cannot put a price tag on your autonomy. Lesson 2 is that setting boundaries is a survival skill, not an act of cruelty. For years, I was conditioned to believe that saying no meant I was a bad daughter, but a boundary is simply a door with a sturdy lock. You are allowed to lock your door against people who only come inside to steal from you, even if those people share your last name. Lesson 3 is that silence is your greatest defense against a narcissist. When David and Brad tried to provoke me into an emotional reaction, I gave them nothing. Narcissists feed on your panic and your anger. When you remove the emotional supply, they starve. They are forced to sit alone with the consequences of their own destructive choices. Lesson 4 is that your chosen family will always outweigh your biological ties. I spent 2 decades trying to earn a seat at a dining room table where I was only valued as a scapegoat. Today, my table is full of colleagues, friends, and mentors who respect my voice. You get to choose who sits at your table. Lesson 5 is that the greatest revenge is building a beautiful life. I did not waste my energy trying to ruin my family. I let their own deceit handle their downfall. I focused all my resources on building a sanctuary for myself and others. When you channel your pain into creation, your abusers lose all their power over your future. I am Brooke Foster, and my story is proof that you can walk through the fire and emerge untouched. You do not have to carry the heavy burden of someone else's dysfunction. You can drop it and walk away. Thank you for listening to my journey here on Senior Echo Stories. If this narrative resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and share your own experiences in the comments below. We are building a strong community of survivors, and your voice deserves to be heard. Until next time, remember to protect your peace and always choose yourself.